Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Denise Doria. I'm Director of Article 19 in the defense of the freedom of speech. It's a great pleasure to have all of you here with us this afternoon. We have been working in Brazil for so long now to protect democracy and to defend freedom of speech. Today we have a talk about fighting disinformation and strategies to defend Brazilian democracy, especially in the run-up to our general elections, which will certainly become more and more intense as the elections actually begin for governors, senators, and many other positions in the public government. And so I'm very happy to be able to have this space here where we can talk about these challenges and bring together so many committed people to really have a good discussion about this. I'd now like to invite our friends from the International Republican Institute.
Obrigado, Denise. My name is Humberto. I'm with the International Republican Institute. I'm sorry I'm going to speak in English because meu português é muito mal e meu portunhol é mais ou menos. We met earlier today with groups from different areas to talk about disinformation. Because we want to learn as much as we can, especially now starting a new program with Article 19 to counter disinformation. This disinformation that we're looking for and targeting is specifically on the integrity of the electoral process. And the goal is to quickly generate antidotes using sanctioned information from TSE and disseminate it with relevant influencers on different social media platforms. To do this, we are establishing partnerships with various CSOs and private sector companies. So we value everyone's input in this project and appreciate all of your time commitment you've given us today. Some of you have been here with us from 9 till 6 in the evening. So thank you so much. And Paulo, pass it to you.
Obrigado, Humberto. Obrigado a todas e todas pela presença. Só agradecer em nome do programa de Digitais, Artigo 19, todas as equipes que ajudaram na promoção e no desenvolvimento desse seminário e dizer um pouquinho sobre o tema geral dessas duas mesas que a gente vai falar. Como já foi dito, há um problema inegável, que é o problema da difusão de informações inverídicas, sabidamente inverídicas, e que colocam
promotion of non-truthful information, which poses a considerable threat to democracy, institutions, and normalcy in Brazil. This has a lot to do with using technologies, but it goes far beyond that. It wouldn't be such a problem if we weren't at a time on the planet where we see so many eroding democratic processes, so many violations and breaches of rights that have already been acquired. So this is a very fruitful time for us to have a good debate about this. We need to remember that there is always a reason for these elements of disinformation to be promoted, and they are always done so for a reason. We are fortunate that we have so many institutions rising up to respond to this disinformation. And many platforms as well are putting together rapid response teams to help fight disinformation. So I would now like to pass the floor on to Sheila de Carvalho, who will preside over this roundtable. I wish you all a great discussion. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to officially open the first roundtable here this afternoon. As Humberto said, we are embroiled in a full day of debate about very important topics, and we want to get this information across to as many people as possible. Just to remind those of you who are just logging on right now, we have two links where you can follow along. One is in English and the other is in Portuguese. So you can follow along in either language. There's also some very important information, some articles and more material that is available if you want to dive further into this topic. As Pajeg just mentioned, we have a challenge today because we are just a few months away from general elections in Brazil, and now we come to think of how we can fight disinformation. We see a serious risk to democracy here in Brazil. It is palpable. Everyone here in this room is concerned with the risk to our democratic stability. We're worried about the risk to our democracy, the risk to our processes, our electoral process, and also the way in which all of these risks have been sustained using disinformation, using purposely false information. So we've been discussing these topics. We have conducted some diagnostics about the seriousness of these threats, and we now have a challenge here on this roundtable to debate what kinds of strategies we will employ to resist this erosion of our institutions, and which could even threaten our electoral process itself. So now we, in this first roundtable, we're going to think about how we can put together a more grassroots and community response to this. There are many institutions present here today that work directly with democratic institutions that are also present here. Many people here have been working, whether in the legislative power or the judicial power, trying to establish new measures and protocols or establish some form of resistance to these attacks against our electoral process. However, we know that the challenge lies in working at the foundations, at the basis of our population, and we know that these are serious threats that affect regular people. So we have a serious challenge here to debate these items. We're going to introduce very shortly three people who have undertaken extremely important projects. We have Brisa Lima from the Marielle Franco Institute, Humberto Ribeiro from Sleeping Giants Brazil, and Jefferson Santos from PerifaConnection. Our goal here is to have a debate about these methods for combating disinformation in different territories. And after each of our guests will introduce themselves and their institutes, we will move on to a discussion. If you don't know me yet, you do know that I talk too much, so I will now pass the mic on. Thank you, Shayla. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to say first that it's very important and we're very proud to be a member here of this panel. I'd like to talk a little bit about Sleeping Giants, how we came about, what problem we encountered. Sleeping Giants is a collective composed of consumers who demand social responsibility from companies in fighting disinformation. we define disinformation as being information that is deliberately created with the goal of misleading people. That is, knowingly promoting false information with the immediate goal of obtaining either financial profit or political gains, whether in Brazil or around the world, or to promote disorder more generally. We define hate speech as any kind of expression, whether that is in words, gestures, or in writing, that is intended to attack a group based on their intrinsic identity, for instance, through their religion, their nationality, their gender, their sexual orientation, or any other similar traits. We also add to this definition hatred focused on class, social class, or economic class. So that includes hatred against poor people, for instance, hatred against straight people. These are all included in our definition of hate speech. And these are the types of things that Sleeping Giants tries to fight. And so we have found that economic gain has been a considerable driver of these techniques and narratives, especially within Brazil. It's very clear to us that in some locations, the creation of disinformation and hate speech occurs mostly because of ideologies. So people who actually believe in those things. And so to understand them, we need to understand the structures that arise to build those value systems. However, the crux of the problem that we have been finding, especially in Brazil, is linked to what I've mentioned, economic gain, financial gain. And that makes creating and spreading these types of content especially profitable. So it's an industry. And how have these activities become industrialized? Well, the main method through which these activities lead to financial profit is by spreading ads, so publicity, in certain platforms that have monetized certain aspects of hate speech. So corporate publicity and advertising is aired on pages and sites that promote hate speech against political hatred, violence, or destabilization of our electoral system. These sites are being hosted on companies such as Meta, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. And these companies have allowed monetization of this type of content. So this type of behavior, which in some cases are manifestly criminal, they should not be permitted to be monetized in whatever platform, whether that's on Meta or any other platform. And Brazilian legislation, in theory, allows this content to be formally described as criminal, and yet it is hosted and promoted nonetheless. Something else that is worrying is that this type of disinformation is often more engaging than truthful information. And this is a result of how these platforms were created. They were built based on algorithms that want users to increasingly remain connected and increasingly consume more and more advertising. So they want users to remain connected, and so they show users highly engaging content. This content makes users never want to log off. And that is another basis behind this problem. The way that this is designed, the content is promoted, and the algorithm favors very, very low content, very low quality content. And so that becomes the purpose of the platform. That is, namely, to collect more data and to distribute more advertising. And so what Sleeping Giants Brazil has been doing over this time is we work on shifting the responsibility so that we don't only look at the person issuing this hate speech, emitting or typing these words. We instead want to look at other organizations that have more power to stop this type of behavior. So we want to transfer responsibility or shift it onto the hands of companies that knowingly ensure that their platforms operate in these ways and that monetize them. What we want to do is to bring into the equation new agents who have previously not been involved. So we want to bring into the debate advertisers that previously were not considered to be part of the problem by any agents. So now we talk to specific companies. We say, hey, listen, you're a company, you're running an ad right next to an attack against our superior electoral college. Do you agree with this type of behavior? Do you think that Google should profit from an attack against our electoral system? Not, and so we bring awareness about this topic to these companies, and these companies very often have values, and even more so, they have international commitments, they have responsibilities, they have signed covenants with the UN, global commitments, global compacts. And in these ways, we are working on convincing them to mitigate some of these actions. So we've been doing some of this work. We've had some success in bringing these agents into the debate and shining the spotlight onto them as well, and really asking them whether they agree with these positions. And we have seen that it has been quite effective to bring these discussions, such as ESG discussions, into the hands of advertisers. So other organizations, especially companies that do concern themselves with environmental, social, and climate issues. So we've brought the fight against disinformation into that circle. And the UN's Global Compact in 2017, for the first time, included in an international document a recommendation that companies and advertising companies should detach themselves or disconnect themselves from companies that profit from racism and other types of hate speech. So that is one win that we have obtained. And we have succeeded in cutting this flow of financing. And we hope to bring that and multiply it to other communities as well, such as the LGBTQI community here in Brazil, which has been targeted here by one particular type of attack, which is gender ideology here, which is to say it has been argued by disinformation promoters that LGBTQ communities and proponents are trying to subvert our youth. This is something that has been occurring a lot here in Brazil, this type of disinformation. And so we want to bring social responsibility into the hands of the companies hiring advertisers. And in short, we want to multiply this into other spectrums as well.
Acho que eu vou parar por aqui por enquanto.
I think I'm going to stop here for now. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Humberto. É muito interessante isso, que traz também para nós uma outra perspectiva, né, acerca de como essa desinformação ela também é sustentada por parcelas do mercado e de como isso também é um problema para além do que a gente vivencia no Brasil, né? Muitos exemplos que você dá
many of the examples that you mentioned here in terms of how this type of hate speech or disinformation speech is supported, and that is often by multinational companies. So beyond the impact that that has on Brazilian democracy, we're also talking about an attempt or potential violation of human rights beyond the Brazilian territory. So it also includes holding companies liable. That's very interesting. So I want to turn over to Jefferson from PerifaConnection. Thank you, Sheila. I was listening to Humberto and trying to find a link with what Perifa does, because I think that we are on the same page when it comes to fighting or countering disinformation, but what we're doing goes in a very different direction. We didn't want or didn't start to try to fight disinformation from a specific starting point or with a specific requirement. There's a little bit of a story that we're trying to tell. We were created to inform people, and that's where the struggle started. PerifaConnection calls itself a point where several activists and communicators meet whenever they're connected with favelas. First of all, in Rio de Janeiro, and then in the last few years, coordinating with several other cities. So why did communication platforms are born? I mean, as we grew and as modernity grew, the communication that you had via physical media or via traditional channels was democratized in a way, but the monopoly that you mentioned on the economic side sort of remained in place. So especially my generation and a few generations before mine began to create these spaces. So we wanted news and journalism that addressed those bodies that were not mainstream, that were not on advertisements and media in general. So we had the Colombo magazine and a media experience that we had in Salvador as well. And I think it's interesting to talk about that, because when we think about citizen input and participation, exercising your citizenship, we think of voting, but people who did not have a high-quality education or dignifying work, access to information becomes a basic thing so that they understand that they can vaccinate or that they're entitled to transportation tickets or to quotas on superior education or higher education. So when we first came up and adopted the PerifaConnection name, that was when a young man called Pedro Gonzaga was murdered in a supermarket in the west side of Rio de Janeiro. And there were many demonstrations as a result of that, but we felt a lack of a critical thought around what was happening. So myself, Raul Santiago, and Wesley Teixeira, who's from the same community as me, began to write saying that the cheapest piece of meat in the market will no longer be that of black bodies. So we began to say that the problem that we had was a lot more structural than that single event that we saw, so much so that we saw the same story repeat itself several times over the last few years. So when we begin to coordinate and adopt this name, PerifaConnection, there were a lot of people saying things that were sometimes interesting, sometimes not, but it was very much white and mainstream. It did not have much to do with the underprivileged outskirts. So if you asked anyone from those communities, they wouldn't really make that connection. So we wanted to really show the other side. What we were already doing with our own communication means, we began to do in means that had a wider reach. First of all, in Folha de São Paulo, where we still have a column today, and then Meia Hora, which is a local newspaper for Rio de Janeiro, but one that has a much more popular language, and that aims to speak to lower income classes. So these people producing content for these means are journalism students and communicators from our communities. Now, what is the difference to do that in these new spaces? Is that people see themselves there. When we see ourselves in any type of information, that gains a whole new meaning for us. So now that we're talking about fake news and a lot of the things that have increased so much right now, what we're doing is we're trying to translate the information to an audience that has a language of their own. So we're allowing for them, that majority, black people, underprivileged communities, sometimes evangelical communities, who speak their own language, and at the same time trying not to connect the narrative to the stereotypes that we have in society. And I think that social platforms really became dominant in that sense, because in the beginning, people do not have access to internet in general. I mean, there are limits to what they can access. And that prevents them from seeing a few things. And so their perspective becomes a lot more biased. So in addition to our work in communication, we also have work in terms of political coordination. So myself and Sheila also are part of organizations connected with the Black movement in Brazil. And in the last few years, we've been working with that. Brisa, the same thing. And we've been working with this for the last few years, which is there's no way of solving whether it's disinformation or political participation unless the racial issue is a starting point, because that implies reflecting or thinking about what our society is. So since last year, we are putting together an agenda in that sense. And it's not like we're reinventing the wheel, because we have a number of political policies, and the Black movement has always been part of that. So what we did was to bring together all of these people from PerifaConnection from all over Brazil, and We had a meeting that became a website, and now we are working on that agenda together with political campaigns and secretaries. I mean, that network includes people who became secretaries of education or secretaries of women's rights, and that has been helping us to build policies, and if we're lucky enough to have an administration next year that has democracy in a higher place, we'll be able to rebuild the parts of policies that have been overturned. And if we do not debate about race or several issues that weren't as important as they became because of social media. So social media is not only poison, but also a medicine. And I don't want to turn this into a different conversation, but we're going to look at many of these symbols over which our generation is responsible. And there's also something that we're calling the ABC of politics, which is to explain to people that their vote is a lot more important than they think. So whenever we talk about right or left, we usually talk about the differences, but there are many similarities. So whenever you're addressing an evangelical community or an evangelical person, if you're talking to your sister in church, my sister, for example, or her friends from church, I will not start any conversation with her talking about abortion or issues that we know will interrupt dialogue. So let's talk about healthcare. Let's talk about education or transportation, things that people are living with every day. And all of that is connected with disinformation, because when we set that aside and believe that a prettier discourse or a number of data points thrown their way will make some change, we actually prevent any change from happening. I'm not sure if I'm making sense in all that I'm saying, but what I wanted was to give you a sense of how communication has changed over the last few years, and that this is not a catch-all that you apply in a simplistic way. We have to think about what the audience is saying all the time, and one of our roles is to not try to produce the type of speech that these people will be adopting later on. That's essentially it.
Muito obrigada, Jefferson.
Thank you so much, Jefferson. Everything that you said brings to mind that perhaps our starting point here for this debate about what we understand about democracy should not be the same. So the Brazilian Black movement has historically reported that in Brazil we never really had a democracy. I mean, what type of democracy is this that excludes part of the population from political decisions, or that has no public policies for Black and brown people? We're talking about centuries of slavery, supported by 1 century of denialism, of ever there being any racism or slavery in Brazil, and all policies that we know to address that began in the 1990s in Brazil. So our understanding, whenever we're debating democracy, has to take all of that into consideration, has to consider what type of democracy is this. And one of the things that this brings to mind most strongly for me is that our democracy is a very new thing. If we look at history, we see even how all of that history has created this fragile democracy that doesn't even include a large part of its population. So as sophisticated as devices have become to spread disinformation, maybe disinformation is a phenomenon that we have experienced throughout our history in different ways. I mean, many of us probably learned in school that it was a white princess who set slaves free from slavery in Brazil. We received narratives that not necessarily coincide with what history actually was. We forget about the resistance in Quilombos and the revolution with Palmares, and we forget how we got to the place that we today call democracy. So it's interesting to think about how persistently disinformation has shaped how we understand democracy and how much it can limit what an actual democratic process can be. This is something that really stood out for me hearing you speak. So as long as there's racism, there will not be democracy. So for as long as we deny the existence of racism and how it shapes Brazilian society, we will not reach democracy in full. So we can't forget about those inequalities, and that can give us a really lopsided view. And another important thing that you said is having your own language. We're not here to establish a homogeneous language, especially when we're talking about a range of places and lives that have to be considered whenever you're devising policy. And this is not what we had over our years of history. I mean, information may come in many different shapes and languages, and that will be adapted to each place, each geographical location. So we have to understand that we're not talking about making or homogenizing any thinking, but to organize what we have as society. And lastly, to conclude our roundtable, I'd like to turn the floor over to Brisa Lima from Marielle Franco Institute. Good afternoon, guys. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you once again for having me. I think it's so important to be here with so many diverse actors talking about this, which is such an urgent matter. For those of you who don't know the Marielle Franco Institute, that's an institute created by the family of Marielle Franco, and for us, disinformation is a front on which we're working, and although we understand that as a single front, it actually pervades many sides of our institute. We have a number of stepping stones in the institute, such as defending memory and fighting for justice, which include countering disinformation. So our mission is to inspire Black women. Our reason for being is to empower other women to continue to change these structures of power. So when it comes to standing up for a people's memory, is ever since Marielle was assassinated, because it was because of that event that the Institute was created. Ever since then, there have been many waves of disinformation about Marielle Franco with the intention of delegitimizing her path, her career, and her work. And what the family feels like is that is like her dying a second time. So these waves of fake news about Marielle led us to develop the disinformation front within the Institute. And in addition to that, we understand that this is a front that is also connected with the Fight for Justice front, because in many times that spreading that type of information is considered part of free speech. So it's very important to have that differentiation. A lot of the time, authorities have this misleading or mistaken understanding that slander, political violence, any violence in that sense would not be considered crimes. Even understandings about anti-racism laws and violence against women and political violence, that leads to that understanding not being observed. So when we are looking at fake news about Marielle, it's important to understand a few things. The first one is what I just said, seeing as this is the type of violence that seeks to deny and kill her a second time. And another thing is we understand hate speech against Black women as political violence. So the Institute works with this category of political violence. We've conducted surveys about that issue, and 80% of Black women who were candidates in the 2020 elections were victims of some type of political violence online. And in addition to disinformation, there was also hate speech, attacks to virtual rooms, many types of other crimes. So understanding that this is political violence, we work some of disinformation on this field.
Another important aspect that we want to bring forward in this debate is to say that for us, online political violence, and that includes hate speech as well as disinformation, this is part of the punitive system that we have in Brazil. There's a lot to unpack there, but basically the public safety system that we have today is based on anti-Black genocide. It's based on this history of slavery that we had for so many centuries, and there has been no attempt at reparations, and this persists to this day, and it affects our public safety. And it says that Black bodies are bodies that can die, that these lives are not worth fighting for. And political violence, it is inserted into this line of thinking because it's not only the state that promotes these killings, this necropolitics, but many different agents, although they don't pull the trigger, whether we're talking about the police or militia, they are agents of the state, and although society doesn't pull the trigger, it does reproduce this line of thinking that Black people's lives are disposable, and it legitimizes this genocide, this philosophy of discarding Black people's lives. So when we talk about disinformation, it's not just fake news that happens. It's fake news and professional strategies that deepen the prejudice and discrimination that people already have. So it's a way of intensifying and radicalizing opinions that some people already have and that perpetuate the system, that violate the lives of Black women, Black people in general. And so, in addition to the Marielle Franco case and trying to seek justice, and here I don't just mean holding responsible the people who committed this political feminicide, but also in dismantling the structural disinformation. We need to talk about recreational racism. We need to hold people accountable for the disinformation that is being spread against Marielle, because this
de violência política virtual. Então, entendemos que o caso da Marielle é case, né?
This makes it more likely for other black women to suffer just as Marielle did. And so we need justice, not just for Marielle, but to create new paradigms that will create precedents that will allow us to ensure that other women can also feel safe within the political spectrum, so that they don't feel threatened. And that includes online political violence. So we do a lot of work, not just in Marielle's specific case and the judicial system, but the very state that should moderate these platforms, I should mention, profit considerably, and they hold economic power, and they're often not held accountable for what happens on their platform. And in the meantime, many women are suffering from attacks that shouldn't occur. Their right to be political agents is being limited, but women are entitled to be political. And disinformation is preventing or at least hindering women from being involved in politics. So everyone and every organization responsible needs to be held accountable because we owe it to other black women. So this morning when we were talking during the first panel that we had, something very important was brought up when we talked about the integrity of the electoral process. We're not just talking about fake news relating to the ballot boxes or to the election day. It really makes us think and question, what kind of democracy are we talking about? Not just formal democracy because, oh, everyone is allowed to vote. No, we're talking about a much more profound democracy. We're talking about shift in power. As Sheila very eloquently put it, we don't have a historical process here. We don't have representation within the institutes and institutions. And what we do see is that the public sector doesn't yet represent the true percentage of women and black people who are in our society, and that also includes other minorities such as indigenous peoples. So it is not reflective of the Brazilian population. And when we see the rise in participation by black women, when we look at that, we see that the rise of black women in politics has always come hand in hand with violence, because we are talking about groups that have historically been ostracized. So, in fighting fake news, it's important to remember that these aren't just aspects, these are structural elements of our culture. These issues are snapshots of a much greater problem. Please cut me off, because if you don't, I'm just going to keep talking. And we do need to have a debate here, so thank you.
Muito obrigada, Brisa. Acho que você coloca aqui uma coisa muito importante de quando a gente está falando.
Thank you very much, Brisa. You mentioned something that I think was really important. The exercise of political rights is also put in check because of disinformation. When we look at disinformation in light of an electoral dispute, we see that these mechanisms and strategies for promoting fake news and disinformation, they often
são de grupos
try
que hoje estão
to
subrepresentados dentro das
harm and
democracias que a gente
limit
vive dentro do Brasil, né?
candidatures
Então,
that
muitas
are
vezes
not
são
interesting
esses mecanismos de
to
informação
certain
que
people.
sustentam essa violência
So
política, né? Isso fica
it's
muito evidente dentro da
political
sua fala.
violence that is
E
being
isso
supported
impede
by fake news.
não só as pessoas
And that
entrarem, né, dentro da
prevents
política,
people not just
né,
from
serem ali,
becoming
exercerem
involved
o seu
in
direito,
politics and from
o seu direito político ativo, né, como a gente
exerting
chama, o direito de
their
ser
active
a pessoa que vai
political
receber essa
right.
votação, mas também
So
ela cerceia o direito
that means
político,
basically
muitas vezes,
people
de quem
who
escolhe
will
essas
be
pessoas,
candidates
ou
and
quem
will
quer
receive
escolher
votes.
essas pessoas
But
para
it
estar
also
dentro desses
means
espaços de
limiting
representatividade, né?
who
Caso recente que eu
the
acho que a gente
population in
pode
general
ter
votes
como
for.
parâmetro é do vereador Renato
Something we can look
Freitas,
at as a
em Curitiba,
parameter
né, que foi
is
alvo aí de
Congressman
processo
Renato
massivo
Freitas in
de fake
Curitiba.
news e
He was the target
desinformação que
of a
levou a
massive
Câmara
fake
Municipal à
news
cassação do seu
attack,
mandato, né?
and it
Então não
led
é só o
the
cerceamento
public
do
sector
direito do Renato que está
to
ali violado, mas também
actually
de todas e todos que votaram nele
disbar
para
him.
que ele fosse o representante, né? Então criaram aí uma narrativa
the city
falaciosa
council
de que ele tinha invadido a
was
igreja, interrompido uma missa,
misled
que isso seria
by
quebra de
fake
decoro
news that he
parlamentar.
had
A própria igreja se
burst into a
manifesta
church,
dentro do
and
procedimento
that was a breach of
administrativo,
decorum,
né?
and so
Falando
he
que
had
não era para
allegedly
cassar
committed a
o
crime.
mandato,
And the church
que estava de
itself
acordo com a
said
manifestação
that
política
he
ali
had
de
done
Renato, que
nothing
estava
wrong,
protestando, né,
and that
em
Renato
relação a uma vida
was
negra perdida, mas
protesting
mesmo assim foi seguido um
against
curso muito
a
alimentado,
black
né,
life
por
that
uma
had been
narrativa
lost.
falaciosa de que ele estava em
But
desconformidade
in spite of all
com a
that,
legislação,
a
com o
very
regimento,
fallacious
enfim. E ele teve
campaign
seu
was
mandato
waged against
cassado,
him,
né, hoje
and
suspenso pela
he
Justiça do
was
Paraná, mas
removed from
né,
office.
há essa decisão de cassação
Today,
do mandato. Então
the
é uma
decision
violência
to remove him
política
from
que ela
office
vai em
has
diversos
been
níveis,
annulled,
né? Tanto que
but
coloca em
the
xeque a
damage was
integridade
done.
física das pessoas,
And it
coloca
also
em xeque
threatens
a integridade
his
virtual, né, das
physical
pessoas que muitas recebem
and
ataques
virtual
online,
integrity.
ataques virtuais,
He
que pode
is
gerar
not only
esse
at
processo de
risk
cerceamento
of,
do exercício do direito político,
of
que
bodily
impacta
harm, but he is
diretamente,
also
né, dentro do
attacked
nosso modelo
online
democrático, do
constantly.
exercício do nosso Estado
And it
democrático de
prevents us
direito, enfim.
from exerting
Eu não
our
sei se alguém
democratic
quer
rights.
fazer perguntas, intervenções.
I want to
A
ask
gente
now
tem
if
um
there's
microfone
anyone on the
ali
floor here,
à
if
direita,
anyone wants to
aberto, assim,
ask
em
any
relação a isso,
questions,
acho que
there
pode
is a
começar.
microphone available.
Aí se mais alguém quiser ir depois, né, que aí a gente faz essa rodadinha aqui para o encerramento da
And
Pode falar.
Legal, super obrigado, super importante os pontos
Thank
colocados.
you very much.
Eu
I
queria
loved
não
hearing
pra
what you had
ninguém
to say.
especificamente, mas quem se
I have a
dispuser
question.
comentar pouco,
It's
acho
not
que,
directed at
o processo
anyone
de
in
desinformação
particular, but
que a gente
anyone is free to
observa,
answer.
né, tem muito
The
a ver
fake
com o
news
movimento,
process that
de
we
negação
observe,
da
it
apuração,
is
da
highly
análise, da
linked
crítica, por isso que
to
os grupos que normalmente produzem
efforts
e
to
propagam,
promote a
processo de informação com
reduction
interesse
in
político, com
fact-checking.
interesse econômico,
And
são
they
os
are
mesmos que
always
atacam, por exemplo, pesquisa,
fueled
universidade, ensino,
by economic
apuração,
and political
checagem de
agendas.
fatos, etc. Então há uma ligação entre
So there's a strong connection
o louvor à ignorância
between
e a propagação
praising
também
ignorance
dessas
and
peças e campanhas
promoting
de desinformação.
these
Nesse sentido, a
disinformation
gente
pieces.
ouviu aqui agora e um pouco de manhã também,
And so in this
há uma
sense,
preocupação
what we've seen just
do ponto de
now
vista
and
da
also this
linguagem,
morning,
porque isso leva
there is
a
a
gente
serious
pensar que,
concern
você vai discutir determinado
with
tema com a
the
pessoa, por
wording
exemplo,
that's
sei lá,
used. So if
seja
you're going to
violência
discuss a
política,
certain
seja urnas
topic,
eletrônicas, etc.
whether it's electronic ballots or whatever the topic is, you're not going to ask someone to read a scientific article about electronic voting or a treaty on the history of political violence. We need to adapt our discourse, our language. So you raised some interesting points, and I'd like to hear a little bit more.
Se há experiências de estratégias de linguagem
Basically,
para
are
rebater
there
esse tipo de coisa
strategies
desse universo que a gente
adapt the
observa,
wording
que seja
of
de alguma maneira
different
rápido, né?
campaigns?
Ele tem que ser, enfim, redes sociais.
Because
Jefferson
everything
falou
on
de
social media
mídias
needs to be done
alternativas
quickly.
mais
Jefferson
tradicionais,
actually
século
mentioned
XX, do
traditional
rádio, enfim, se eventualmente
versus
também a entrada em
alternative
rádios
media,
comunitárias,
such as community
isso
radios,
possibilita
and
né,
that
atingir determinados
might
públicos que a gente não
allow
atinge,
audiences
peças de redes
that we might not
sociais, etc.
otherwise
Então,
reach.
Resumindo a pergunta é o
hear what we have
seguinte,
to say.
E vocês falaram da
to
centralidade
summarize,
da questão da violência política nessas
also based on what you
eleições.
said about
Tudo que é essa produção de
political
desinformação tem
safety,
servido muito também ao
fake
acirramento e
news
intensificação de
has
violências históricas.
really intensified
Quais são as
historical
estratégias de
violence.
comunicação nesse
So I want to ask
sentido,
you,
de
what are the
contra-desinformação, que
communication
vocês observam que
strategies
podem ser
to fight
adequadas nesse momento de
disinformation that
intensificação
might be appropriate
desses
right now
debates
at
e
a
de
time when we
ataques
see
constantes? Quer dizer,
an
como é que,
intensification
considerando que tá muito difícil
of
a gente
these
conversar com a
attacks,
sociedade de uma forma
it's
geral,
very
e a gente
difficult right
falou
now
disso,
for
dos
us
tipos de
to
linguagem, dos
talk
tipos de formatos,
to our
tipos de estética,
society.
qual estratégia vocês
So what
apontariam,
strategies
assim, como,
would you
através da experiência que
recommend
vocês tiveram, que são
based
importantes
on
pra
the experiences that you've
dessas
seen
atividades dos próximos 3 meses aí
and what you've
eleitorais,
had
com tudo isso que a gente
for
está
the
observando?
3 or
Obrigado,
4
gente.
months to come?
Obrigada, Paulo. Mais alguém?
Thank you, Paul. Anyone else?
Mais uma.
Okay, we have another question coming.
Se puder se apresentar e fazer pergunta?
Meu
If
nome
you
é
could please
Raquel
introduce
Master,
yourself.
sou do
Yeah, I'm
coletivo
Raquel Master.
Intervozes.
I'm from the
Eu queria
Intervozes Collective.
fazer uma pergunta, na verdade, para o Humberto,
I
pegando
wanted
já
to ask Humberto a
que o Paulo
question,
trouxe, que é falar
also
um pouco
picking
da
up on
campanha
what
Black
Paula
Book
brought,
Talk,
which
né,
is
que
I wanted you to talk
foi
about
feito aí
the Black
também
Book
para já
Talk
trazer essa responsabilidade
campaign
também
and the
pro
effort
caso
to
do
bring the
Google. Aí eu queria que você
responsibility
falasse um pouquinho como
on
é que foi a
Google's case.
construção
So I wanted you
disso,
to
né,
talk a
como
little
que você
bit
chega
about
nessa estrutura da
how did you
campanha,
get to
que também
the
o Intervozes
structure that the
estava presente.
campaign had.
Mas eu queria também
But I
falar um
also
pouco de uma
wanted to
estratégia
talk
que
a
a
little
gente
bit
está
about
construindo,
one strategy that we're putting together,
principalmente para a gente combater a desinformação
which is precisely
na Amazônia
to
Legal,
fight
através de
disinformation
grupo de trabalho
regarding
que
the
envolve
legal
10
Amazon. And this is a work that involves 10 different organizations, 7 of which are in the Amazon, and this is one where our collective is also part of. We want to conduct a survey to understand who in that area is spreading disinformation, to both have strategies to counter them and to have strategies to pursue a safer, fairer election process. And one way we have found to do that is to establish dialogue. And in the first survey that we conducted, we found 70 journalistic groups currently spreading disinformation in the Amazon region, and we are still struggling to bring to fore this type of information, bring it to the public, so that it is not only available to our collectives, but to the public in general, and whether these journalistic groups are in any way connected with politicians. So what I wanted was for all of you to talk a little bit about this relationship between a few candidates and public figures in Congress or otherwise who are using public funds or other types of funds to also finance the promotion of fake news and disinformation, and whether you're already thinking about that and have strategies in that sense as well. Okay, thank you. Anyone else who would like to ask or comment?
Comentar, trazer ideias.
Maybe bring new ideas. I don't know. Hi, I'm Elise from Disinformation. I'm going to pick up on what Pajé said as well. We mentioned this in the morning, but also in the afternoon when it comes to access to information, especially thinking about zero rating, which is something that often limits access to information from several groups in society who are very much focused on Facebook or WhatsApp, apps that have particular contracts or agreements with telecom operators. So I wanted to understand whether there's any space to discuss in these fronts, especially with WhatsApp and other companies, to develop strategies to counter disinformation on these spaces, to think that maybe some of the people who will receive that fake news or that disinformation will not have the means to research whether that or to fact check that. And more specifically to Jefferson, I wanted to ask about that type of communication outside of social media. How can we establish a dialogue there? I mean, on social media, a lot of what we say is magnified, but how can we fight disinformation in community spaces outside of the logic of those social media networks? Because in that space, we do not have the same scope and the same amount of audiences that we have online. Okay, I think we can come back to our roundtable now. Anyway, adding to all those questions and bringing to what we have here in the roundtable, we focused on community strategies, adopting grassroots language and what's being done in every location, and how can we turn these strategies, these community strategies, to become institutionalized, and how we can bring this type of policy to institutions and corporations. So we'll start with Jefferson.
Não, eu pedi para começar porque eu acho que eles dois vão ter mais trabalho.
I wanted to begin because I think they will have more things to say, but after Lisa's last question, I'm thinking, I have a feeling whenever we have these talks, which are very productive, that we are often trying to find a magical solution for every problem. So strategies and assets are always things that we tap into, but ultimately what we want is to exchange information. We want to have a conversation. And I think that even amongst ourselves, people involved in the fight for freedom of expression and in journalism and social activism in general, the time we spend doing this, we sometimes lose and sometimes also waste society's time in a way, because we often lose focus when we do that. And I'm talking a lot about the underprivileged communities and a profile of groups that have grown significantly, which is the evangelicals, and also women in general. I think there's one point there, which is how can we bring back that type of communication, because it tells a lot about it really speaks to a credibility, because ultimately what gives a piece of fake news credibility when it's being circulated amongst religious groups is the fact that the pastor shared that initially, and he is someone that they see as someone who's truthful, or maybe because they received that from a successful merchant. So we have to understand that this problem, it does not stem from the elections. This is just a time when it becomes more critical. But I think that this attention and allowing these people to be part of the debate and of these spaces where we're building something, it's very important for us to find echo. Otherwise, we will always be just promoters of a message that doesn't reflect the people we're talking about. And another thing that she said, I think, also has to do with the credibility. It has to do with who's close to you. So if you hear from a taxi driver or a motorcycle delivery person sharing that information, if those are people close to you, maybe that is the information that will be relevant to you. Maybe you will hear in mainstream media that that is fake news, but of course, this is very important work, but people will not go to fact-checking websites to see whether what they received is true or not, or even to the Superior Electoral Court's website to check whether the information they received about the elections is accurate or not. So I think there's really a detachment from people's reality that we still haven't been able to gap. I mean, we haven't yet acknowledged that we may not have solutions for things yet. And I'm seeing several success cases that we see that people manage to do that. So what is a success case? What is a success case in the when we have a billboard on the main avenue, when everyone else is in the train? So people only realize that the government isn't doing what it's supposed to when they pay their bills on the supermarket or when they need a doctor and that's not available. So there's a lot that we have to do that's not connected to communication products. If we were able to have a more holistic view in that sense, maybe we would be more counter-hegemonic, so to speak. And we have to understand that we do not have any mastery of the communication in terms of the content. So I think that's what it is about, essentially, but it's a long-term work. And we have to understand that new things may come up beyond what we already see. And I feel like I'm saying a lot of things here that don't make a lot of sense, but this is a debate that we need to have. We need to let go of some of the truths that we are holding so close to us, and with that, we'll have a healthier discussion. Thank you. I think you touched on a few key points that we have to be concerned about and have to pay attention to. Brisa? I took some notes as you guys were speaking, and the first one had to do with language. When it comes to disinformation, disinformation is a language practice. So, since before the internet age, there's a language practice where people will sometimes exaggerate when they're telling a story. And as Jefferson said, I don't think there are ready-made answers, and there's no silver bullet, but I would like to shine a spotlight on a few possible paths. I think there's the issue of adapting the language. Also, we must understand what it is that we're dealing with before we think about the solution. Because when we are dealing with disinformation, we're not talking about an individual who is adding to their story or embellishing their story. We're talking about one that is a global issue, an issue that involves significant structures, power structures, sexism, capitalism, and also involves LGBTQ phobia and involves professionalization. And we have to look at that. So when we have this scenario under Trump, for example, we often have a feeling that if they're sharing fake news, they're exercising their free speech. But there is research that shows
maioria da desinformação que é produzida, que é colocada na internet, vem de grupos muito específicos. Não é só que todo mundo resolveu falar que as urnas são fraudadas. Então, essas desinformações são produzidas. Então, elas são produzidas e são produzidas a partir de estudos em relação aos grupos. Então, quando a gente está falando sobre adaptação de linguagem, muitas vezes a gente tenta falar com todo mundo. E o que esses processos de desinformação fizeram foi criar processos de comunicação específicos para determinados grupos. Então, acho que o primeiro passo também é a gente não tirar as pessoas de burra,
the first step we must take is to stop thinking that everyone is stupid. And that's something that the educated left usually does. I mean, sometimes those people are receiving information that's supposed to reinforce biases and prejudices that they already have.
De desinformação. Então, assim, como exemplo para a gente
as an example for us to give you, I have the disinformation campaign that was conducted against Kamala Harris. It also involved fake news to specific targeted groups, one of which was precisely the Black community. There was some piece of news that said that she was not Black enough because there was someone who was white in her family. There's also fake news that saying that people from people in her family, her ancestors, was slave owners. So it's important for us to move forward in evaluating and assessing this problem and understanding how the platforms work. And I think Humberto will be able to talk a lot more about this, seeing it's the focus of his organization. But there's also research showing how these platforms make people's opinions more radical over time. We even heard that via communication in Facebook, they went from people who were pro-opening to groups that were pro-Trump, and they ultimately became militia groups. So there's a radicalization in place where these opinions and this polarization is being reinforced by these platforms. And in closing, seeing as we're talking about global issues, we also need to think about global strategies, because our democracy is severely affected by even considering the geopolitical position of Brazil in the world. Today, for example, has a much more critical role to play in our elections than it does in the US elections. And that helps us to understand how disinformation processes are advancing in other countries. We're talking about a platform that go beyond our borders, and we need to think about how we think our strategies beyond Brazil. So to understand how countries in Europe are dealing with that and are being affected by these structures. I also wanted to share with you one of our initiatives about political violence, which involves political violence online. So we have these goals relating to the 2022 elections, requiring parties to offer protective structures for women candidates and also to change their bylaws to adapt to the legislation, and also to create channels for these women to report any violation.
para mostrar, né, que como esse problema da violência política não afeta só essas mulheres negras, mas afeta a própria democracia. Então, para quem quiser e puder apoiar, a gente tem um site, nãoseremosinterrompidas.org, e a gente está querendo chegar a 5.000 assinaturas para a gente poder entregar, né, essas recomendações que a gente tem, essas reivindicações que a gente tem, né, em relação à proteção das mulheres negras
we
em
have
2022,
many
né,
initiatives
dos direitos
to
humanos, que
protect
estão
black
aí,
women
né,
and protect human
denunciando essa série de
rights.
violações que a gente está falando
So
aqui, né, que perpassam
we
a nossa
help
sociedade.
people
Então a gente quer
report
levar agora em agosto para o TSE, para o
infractions,
Ministério Público
and
Eleitoral
we
e
want
para os
in August
partidos, né, recentemente
bring
também com esse caso que aconteceu
this
no Nova
proposal
Iguaçu.
to
A gente
the
oficiou
Superior
os
Electoral
partidos
Court
também
and to the
para
different
que eles
parties.
tomem
We
providências,
have
né,
notified
porque
the
a gente entende
parties
que a
and asked them
responsabilização
to take
é um problema
steps
complexo, então a responsabilização
because
é
we know
coletiva, então o
that
Estado tem um papel, a sociedade tem outro papel, os partidos
accountability for
políticos,
these
né, os
issues is
fundos
very
de
complex.
proteção também.
The
Então,
political parties
enfim, por
and
favor,
funds
quem puder aí,
need to get
esteja
involved.
assinando
So
a nossa
please
campanha também, que a gente está
sign
querendo
our petition
enfim,
and
avançar
join
na
our
proteção dessas
campaign.
mulheres. Obrigada.
Thank you.
Eu vou pegar um pouco um ganchinho no que você estava falando agora, Brisa, e também um pouco ali no que...
On the note, Brisa, of what you were talking about, and what Raquel said from Intervozes as well, thinking about the geopolitical issues that affect us, they, what happens is that the same policies that are available in the global north are often not available in the global south. One example is the Political Transparency Report. This is a report that was developed by Google, and it allows any user, any researcher, any person to identify types of narratives that are being promoted or driven by Google's advertising service, specifically focusing on political issues. This tool was developed in 2018, and it's available in over 34 countries, and it was only made available in Brazil after massive campaigning. And nevertheless, it's available here in a vastly different way than in the global north. Here, it's only available, the only information that we have is expenses from the federal candidates, which leaves aside the vast majority of candidates. So it keeps us from accessing information pertaining to state candidates and even to municipal candidates and mayors who continue to run ads and whose participation in this year's elections are also important if we are to understand what kind of narrative is being driven. In the 2016 elections in the US, we saw that online advertising was used by the former President Donald Trump as a way of manipulating Latin American and African American communities, and in attempts to drive these communities away from ballots. So this was targeted misinformation based on of lying about the voting dates, methods, and other details. So this type of action is engaged using online ads. Now, we're of course talking about elections because that's what's coming up. And since as early as 2018, this tool could have been available in Brazil and in other countries. So these tools are important for us to have even the most basic type of protection from disinformation, because we want to understand how these narratives are built and distributed and promoted to different groups. How are the fake news narratives developed? Who is creating these groups? Because they are studying social behavior to build that message more effectively, to target it, to target hate speech, or even messages that are intended to polarize religious groups, for instance. And so by using these tools, we would be able to understand a little bit better how these narratives are employed. And we would have better conditions, we would be more fit to develop a higher quality debate, and we will be able to really have our right, which is our right to good quality information. And we would have been able to expand the information, the true information that circulates. So I want to ask you all, how can we build better narratives? We mentioned academic papers. You can't fit an academic paper on Twitter. You need to fit into the however many different characters. So you need to try to understand the dynamics of these networks so that we can claim a little bit of the space that's in them. So recently, a group of creators has managed to organize. I've seen this happen specifically on TikTok and Instagram, and they have created very simple narratives that have really summarized some counter-narratives in a single sentence. And based on that single sentence, they have created a shared strategy for promotion and discussion. And they've based the topic on a single, uniform narrative. The field of disinformation has been doing that. They've really worked on unifying their narrative so that every member of the ecosystem can work in sync. And I think that our field also needs to organize. We need to use organized strategies to fight the organized strategies that are being used against us. Even Representative Brani Brioli, last month, she was attacked in the Legislative Assembly building in Rio de Janeiro. I can't even repeat the slurs that she was called, but part of our members started a strategy which was just simply asking people to follow Brani Brioli on social media. And at that moment, that was a very effective strategy. Brani Brioli herself said on her social media how important this was for promoting growth in her social media, and it would have been even better if we had been able to organize more effectively, but we did manage to organize at least a little bit. And people who are suffering political violence,
não só difundir, reproduzir e amplificar o ataque da pessoa que
they need to have a voice.
O que a gente foi observando também, né, pelo menos desde 2016,
and their attackers need to be muscled.
Isso é uma estratégia desse grupo que tenta.
This is a strategy being used by fake news promoters. They do this purposely to increase the repercussions and developments on social media and to gain more followers.
Essa intolerância, né, esse grupo de
They want to
a gente precisa pensar em estratégias
increase intolerance. So we need to think of efficient strategies, especially now, so that we don't fall into these traps, and so that we can promote the voices of the people being attacked.
Era muita coisa, me perdi.
I'm not sure if I've answered everything. I think there are still some more.
Obrigada, Humberto. Obrigada,
Thank you,
Brisa.
Humberto.
Obrigada,
Thank you, Brisa. Thank you, Jefferson.
Como a gente viu aqui, não é fácil, né?
As we have just seen,
poderia ficar aqui
it ain't
bom
easy.
tempo
I'm sure we
ainda,
could
e talvez a
spend
gente nem
a long
conseguisse
time
chegar
here
a
debating and probably
soluções concretas,
wouldn't
né, para além do que a
reach
gente está trazendo aqui,
all
que
the
mostra o
concrete
desafio que a
solutions
gente
that
tem nas
we
mãos
want,
aí pelos
because we have a
próximos
huge
anos,
challenge
né,
ahead
não
of
só de
us
agora.
over the
Então,
years to come.
agradeço aqui artigo 19,
thank you so
agradeço
much, Article
o
19.
International
Thank
Republican
you
Institute
to the
por esse
International
debate,
Republican
né?
Institute
A gente tem
for
mais
this
uma
debate.
mesa agora que vai debater
We have
desinformação
another
agora
roundtable
às
now
4, né? Mas primeiro a gente vai fazer um
4,
breve intervalo
but
para um
first
break.
we have a
A gente volta
brief
daqui
coffee
15
break.
minutos. Gostaria
So
muito
we'll
de
be back
agradecer
in
a
about
participação
15
de
minutes.
todas e todos,
Thank you
da
everone
participação
for
aqui das
being
nossas
here.
palestrantes
Thank you
dessa
to
mesa.
our speakers here at this
E
roundtable.
boa tarde. Até
And have a great rest of the afternoon.
tarde, todos e
Good
todos.
afternoon, everyone.
E bem-vindos de volta ao segundo painel, a segunda sessão do seminário Enfrentando a Desinformação sobre Processos Eleitorais no Brasil, mapeando possibilidades e estratégias para a defesa democrática.
The second panel within the program of our event. We have the thank you for the support of IDA and everyone who's here. We would like to thank all of you again for your inputs. Well, the idea of this roundtable, and we will introduce our guests one by one, but what we wanted is to have more of an institutional perspective on the moment that we're living and how we are dealing with this phenomenon, which is not a new one, but still has a fundamental impact on society and many of its dynamics. And I think that in a more urgent way, it has been affecting this time, which is a time of elections that involves a number of pain points that we all know very well. So a few things that I would like to say right now before I turn over to Tiago, who will be talking about this time of elections. I come from the free radio times, and I come from social sciences and not law. And a few things that I learned by studying unlawful radio broadcasting, one of the arguments that we had was what we did, which was to have a low-power satellite to broadcast what we were doing in a short range, although legitimate, was still illegal. And there was no damage, there was no malice in what we did. So in order to, for a crime to be coded, there has to be malice. And in our case, we worked on with a range of frequency that was not being occupied, so we were not interfering with anyone's right to free speech, and we learned that there's no crime if there's no malice. So today, we were discussing who defines what disinformation is, and when it comes to accountability, who's held accountable, and how do you grade violations so that you understand how you will address it. So one of the things that we've been thinking about over the over recent times is ways to find accountability and how can we monitor these violations and understand the damage that they cause, and in a way hold those who have any interest in moving forward with these campaigns are held accountable. So I think one of these major issues that pervade today's debate is this: how do we remedy that? I think we have heard many opinions about that. I mean, first of all, we can't judge individually what disinformation is. I mean, we need criteria, we need parameters, and we work with the international human rights and free speech patterns, which is something that we are always discussing. We have discussions about how to hold platforms and technology companies accountable. And another important thing is, how do we demand accountability from public authorities? And we know today that there is a hand of public authorities in how these disinformation pieces are spread, and this takes us to a field that's also very thorny, because freedom of speech has as its backbone defending political speech. So everyone needs their right to free political speech being held true and protected. So we can't hold people or we can penalize people for defending or for standing up for what they believe politically. So whatever the cause and whatever the position that the person speaking occupies. I mean, there are some here who are more influential than others, but, for example, those who are better known, the responsibility over what I say or over what the president says or a mayor says has to be different, and I think that's one of the parameters we have to think about. And going back to my radio days, I think one of the parameters we need to establish this discussion about communication is precisely that, what the malice is, how extensive it is, and what's the interest that people have in disseminating some types of fake news. And so I am going to invite Thiago Gottesek from the Superior Electoral Court, and I would like to thank the Superior Electoral Court for sending someone to talk to us. Good afternoon, everyone.
Boa tarde a todos. Como nosso tempo é curto,
now, because our time is short, I will try to summarize what we have been doing since 2018. That was when we began to realize that the disinformation process was also tackling the electoral process. So since 2018, the court has been organizing and talking to civil society and scholars about this issue. From that, we created a committee that was set up first in 2020 and then on the administrative level, as opposed to only on the legal side. And on the administrative level, what I can say we've learned during this time is, first of all, this is not a regulatory initiative. It is an administrative initiative, and it's a network-related initiative. And just to give you an idea, we have 150 people involved with the program currently. So this brings a number of positive effects in terms of countering that issue. The program is currently divided into 3 fronts. First, to inform, second, to build skills, and third, to respond, and the quicker the better. In terms of informing people, we've been trying to create the right language to inform people how ballot boxes work and what are the most important factors involved in the electoral process. How do we inform in different types of language? And I think the previous panel addressed that in a very interesting way. And the second thought is skills building, because disinformation, and I don't want to, say what's already been said, but there are so many different topics that we, as the Superior Electoral Court, has to have the skills to encompass all of that. So we have over 1,500 volunteers, and since 2018, we've all been trying to bring more accurate and precise information about the process. And it's important to highlight that within the scope of the program, the context is that we are trying to inform about the process and not parties specifically. And how have we operated so far? We have sought relevant actors, especially in recent times, also on the digital space, because from 2020 to 2022, we have 33 new participants in the process. We are a continent-sized country, and the pandemic has really accelerated the adoption of online spaces. And we are seeking for the most important actors. And because we have a dialogue with the platforms here today, I'm going to stress their work with the platforms, but we also work, for example, with mobile phone operators. Brazil has a huge percentage of people that do not have telephone credits, prepaid credit, and they ultimately have a number of restrictions to their online activity. And a lot of disinformation is circulating in these spaces, and often voters do not have access, because of this lack of infrastructure, to the mainstream press. So what do we do in that sense? We go to telecom operators, and in 2020, all of them offered free access, even if you did not have a data plan, to any content on the federal justice website. So we also went to platforms, first of all, so that we had a touch point, and after the first contact, we try to have an MOU so that every initiative is clear and is clear to all society and also above board. At no point, as I said, we do not have the power, and we cannot seek to demand anything from those platforms. We are often questioned about that, and what we try to do is have those platforms speak to society about all the initiatives they are about to take. That document is publicly available, and after that, we try to develop new initiatives for each different context. And because our time is short, I wanted to stress something that we're doing this year, which is we try to have with all platforms, there are 11 of them right now, all of them have policies which were clearer about disinformation, especially when it came to civic actions such as the election process. The second was to have all of them offer a channel that's out of court. So with our partners, we are pointed toward disinformation about the ballot boxes, and we want an extrajudicial channel to receive that information. So we have that agreement with all platforms. And third, we have been trying to raise these platforms' awareness and encourage them to really take action, such as demonetizing and reducing the reach of those pieces of disinformation. I think the important thing is for this structure to be discussed and for each platform to operate always trying to be as clear and transparent as possible so that everyone can assess what each one of them is doing on the digital space. We recently created an alert system about the elections. Any voter can go to the Superior Electoral Court's website and report any type of inauthentic behavior or data breach, so that a team within the court analyzes that report and passes that along to the platform so that something is done about it. Of course, we cannot and we do not have the power to require platforms to do anything about them. What we do is pass along those reports and expect them to do what they promised they would beforehand. And I think my time is running out already, but I would like to invite everyone to participate in that process with us. All of you, CSOs, academia, companies that want to contribute to this year's election, because I think this year's elections are one of the most important ones that we will have in our recent history. So the message here is, we are countering disinformation as a network. We can't work alone. And I think that what we can do this year is try to have more data and a more decentralized access to what's going on online, allowing everyone to assess that very quickly in a very agile way. Just to give you an idea, on the Sunday when elections are held, the Superior Electoral Court's website has the equivalent traffic to that of the most important news portals in Brazil at the same time. The impact is so humongous, and that is such a big topic during that weekend. And we're often talking about what type of disinformation. We're talking about some fake news. And just to give you an idea, in 2020, Facebook removed over 140,000 posts of fake news about the election process during the election weekend. So, to go vote, do I need a pen? Do I need to take my ID? This is a type of debate that we often fail to have, but there's such a dearth of information about, what the candidates' numbers are and how to type their numbers on the ballot box. And we believe that once the work is done, even considering the experience that we have, whenever there's something going against the election process, some candidates can perform better because of that. So I think that's essentially it, and we'll welcome any further questions. Thank you.
Comentário super rápido, assim, reconhecer que o TSE vem, enfim, acho que não tinha outra saída, mas vem empreendendo uma série de ações interessantes no sentido de uma maior transparência, uma maior abertura, um maior diálogo com várias instâncias da sociedade. Eu recomendo aqui muito o canal do Telegram do TSE. Eu acho que
has been engaging in a number of initiatives to spread information, and you're really to be congratulated, so kudos to you. We have some contacts at the Superior Electoral Court, and your Telegram channel has a number of very truthful facts that you post. So it's really to be commended. And you still see that there are some people who log in for the sole purpose of going there to vote down the court's posts. Lots of people actually they do post thumbs up. So congratulations.
Algumas pessoas não leem a matéria para baixo, mas sim, e tem assim muitos assinantes do canal.
There are many subscribers. It's a pretty big channel.
Elogios, quer dizer isso também que esses passos que o TSE tem tomado.
I also want to mention that these steps that the court has been taking recently, after seeing all the voting technologies that have been implemented,
e a gente sabe dos
we
problemas
know
que a
that
justiça brasileira tem.
the Brazilian legal system has a number of issues, and the court is super important.
Tem uma capacidade técnica e de pessoal
It has
muito
an
grande.
incredible technical
Muitos
ability and
pesquisadores, a sociedade dizia e
so much
pedia uma
personnel,
maior transparência também do TSE,
and
não
we
só
know
na questão da
that
tecnologia das urnas,
academics
mas,
have
enfim,
been
acho que
asking
o que
for
está
more
acontecendo agora
transparency,
é fruto também
and
de
I
uma
think that
abertura, uma
what
pressão da sociedade para que a gente
the court
consiga
is doing
conhecer a
recently
instituição, consiga dialogar
really
com a
is
sociedade
the
para que
fruit
esse papo
of
em torno da ordem
these
democrática
requests,
se
and
mantenha.
that
Então,
helps
super
promote
obrigado. Acho que vocês
democracy.
têm
So
super
thank
desafio pela
you,
frente,
truly. I know you have a
tão
huge
grande,
challenge ahead of you,
quanto o de empresas de
and it
de
might
tecnologia
be
também. Então, passo aqui a
perhaps
palavra
just
para a Priscila
as
Couto Meta,
huge
para falar
as
pouco pra
technology
gente também dos
companies.
desafios
And
aí
so on that
da
note, I
Obrigado.
pass the mic on to Priscilla Couto from Meta.
Obrigada, Pajé. Boa
Thank
tarde a
you,
todos e
Pajé.
todas.
Good
Eu
afternoon,
quero inicialmente
everyone.
agradecer ao artigo 19
First,
da
I'd
URI
like
pelo
to
convite,
thank Article
saudar
19 and the RI
esse
for
painel.
this
Eu tenho
invitation,
tanto orgulho de fazer
and
parte,
to
saudar o TSE na pessoa do Thiago Rondon,
give
por todo o
my
excelente
appreciation
trabalho que vem
to
sendo
this
feito
this panel of very esteemed colleagues that are here with me. I know, Tiago, the court has been really working hard to fight fake news. Well, my name is Priscila Couto. I am manager of public policies at Meta Brazil. So today I'm going to be talking about Instagram and Facebook, and very briefly going to mention some of the initiatives that we have today to fight disinformation. Firstly, I need to mention that integrity is essential in all our platforms, and the work that we do around election time is not a one-off thing. This is actually work that the company has been undertaking for many years now, not just in Brazil, but also around the world. Today we have over 40,000 people working in Brazil and around the world in the integrity and the security team. This staff is divided into more than 40 teams at Meta. Just to give you an idea, in 2021 alone, Meta invested $5 billion in integrity. And when we talk about integrity, that also includes electoral integrity. And as I mentioned, this work is constant, and it involves constant lessons learned in many different elections all around the world. And the peculiar thing about Brazil is that in Brazil, every 2 years, there is an electoral cycle. So I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that for sure, once we finish this electoral cycle here in 2022, the first thing we're going to do is start working on the 2024 elections. I want to share some initiatives that we have been implementing in partnership with the Superior Electoral Court and to promote the integrity of the voting process. We had a number of meetings in May and June to establish baselines and education about not just the Superior Electoral Court, but also all of the different electoral courts, so that they can more assertively work to fight fake news and so that we can comply with their messages more responsively. So this morning we mentioned the electoral tag or filter. This is applied on Facebook and Instagram on any topic related to voting. And once you click on that link, it'll take you directly to the Superior Electoral Court's website. And that's on the left. And here on the right, you'll see a reminder reminding people to get ready to vote. This was initially launched in the April 28th to May 4th week. This was the final week before the deadline before Brazilian citizens had to get their voting registration in order, and which is mandatory in Brazil. And so we reminded everyone to make sure that their voter IDs were in order. So this label, once we launched it in the early months of the year, this led to a tenfold increase in traffic to the Superior Electoral Court's website. And this label was applied to 2.8 million pieces of content. This is a pretty shocking number for us, and it shows us how eloquent Brazilian users are when it comes to the topic of voting. So 2.8 million pieces of content, so that includes posts and other shared media. Something else I want to show you is our center of operations for voting issues. We have this office where we bring together our main departments and specialists who are involved with the voting world to respond to any kind of threat that we can ascertain on our platforms. And again, that means Facebook and Instagram. So this is done to ensure a quick response, whether that means content that can somehow incite voter suppression or violence, or maybe hacks or coordinated unlawful or inauthentic behavior, or anything that forges or falsifies the public sector's voice with regard to voting. And this is our public database. So this is very important to us, very dear to us. When we started requesting, or demanding, I should say, that any advertiser who wants to post a political ad, they need to fill out a form identifying themselves. They need to prove, especially, that they are located in Brazil, and these ads can only be targeted to Brazilian users. And so we have a library of ads. This has existed since 2018. Now, since late June, in addition to political and electoral ads, we've also added a third category, which is social issues. So political, electoral, and social. You can not just see what ads are active, but you can also see all inactive ads from the past 7 years. So, something that happened on the first panel comes to mind. We removed a large number of micro-segmentation requirements for targeted ads that previously existed. So, looking at the issue of social issues, when you visit our ad library, which has a website of its own, and so it can be accessed by anyone, you do not need to have a Facebook or Instagram account to look at our ad library. But you can run a keyword search, whether that means a brand name or a candidate name or anything like that. You will find all sorts of information about that advertiser and all the ads that they have and have had, not just on Facebook but also on Instagram. So transparency is very important for us, and we like to provide as much information as possible. Our library also has open access to this information, so any visitor can print out this information or download it into and work on it on a spreadsheet or something like that. And lastly, I want to talk about our disinformation combat strategy. So first is removal. So that means removing content that breaches our community standards. Some policies that will lead to content being removed includes promoting voter suppression, as Tiago mentioned. Some people tried to say that the first session of our elections were going to be held on a different date, for instance. Or someone who posts a candidate's photo with a different candidate code. So this type of ad is forbidden on our platform, and it will be removed. And next, we have content that is potentially in breach. And so when we find that through a combination of technology and people, I should mention we have over 16,000 analysts around the world doing this work. When they identify that a piece of content is potentially in breach of our policies, then that piece of content's reach will be reduced and it'll be added to the fact checkers queue. So we have a number of press agencies like the AFP, Reuters, Lupa, Os Fatos, Verifica, and UOL as well. So these fact checkers, they actually go through and check the content to make sure whether or not it is in breach. So if they identify that it is, in fact, disinformation, then this piece will receive a filter added onto it. And that's where we loop in our third pillar, which is information. So whenever there's a piece of content that is found to be in breach, any user who sees this content will have a link to a page telling them just why that content is in breach or fake or whatnot, because we want to inform users, not just online, but also offline. If we were to simply remove it, that would not be efficient, because we know very well that the fake information would not cease to exist. And so when we give users access to this type of information that has been checked and verified by journalists, then we have the option to give them the tools to talk to their families and friends and to then spread good information, real news. And lastly, I want to share with you our Brazilian Elections Center. This website has the purpose of being a giant hub combining all sorts of information about our Brazilian voting and elections. So we've held online summits. And I'd also like to invite you to visit when you can. We have two guides here. One on the left is the guide for women in politics in 2022. This was launched in Brasilia with support from the Superior Electoral Court. And we have a one-pager about the Brazilian elections in 2022. And that will give you more detailed version of all the information I mentioned today. Thank you very much.
Super obrigado, Priscila. Eu acho que vou passar direto para dentro do canal do Twitter também, e aí depois eu faço mais uma mediação antes de passar para os próximos convidados. Então, obrigado.
Bom, agradeço. Pri, adorei sua
thank you. I loved your presentation, Pri, as always. You spoke really well. Thiago, great pleasure to be here with you, representing all the work that we've been doing together with the Superior Electoral Court, and I'm a living testimony of how devoted he is to this cause. And I also would like to greet Katie. It's great to see her again and have her as part of our panel, visiting Brazil for maybe the 20th time, almost understanding Portuguese at this point, I imagine. She loves Brazil. So, my mission today is to tell you a little bit about the role Twitter is playing during the elections and what we've been doing to collaborate with the 2022 elections. I also have a presentation because I have first-hand news that we heard just this morning for you. So very fresh news and also data. I know you guys really like data, and I wanted to be able to show all of that to you. So if you could please put up my presentation. Okay, so I have the clicker. So today I have 3 points on the agenda that I would like to cover with you. First of all, how is Twitter working to bring context and high-quality information for people while they're using our services? And here, we're focusing a lot on the elections. I think it's important to mention that Twitter doesn't work with disinformation in a binary way, meaning either removal or maintenance. Why is that? And this is something Priscilla talked about very well. Of course, and this is something specialists know really well, disinformation is still being studied, but whenever someone shares a piece of fake news, studies show that, first of all, the person identified with that piece of news. This is very important information. So when we create opportunities for education and for friction for that people, leading them to a counter-narrative of that disinformation, we are creating, first of all, an opportunity for education to create friction for them, and second, creating the opportunity for other people, if they go to our services to find out about that information, they will have the opportunity to understand from correct information why that was the case. And then I'll be talking about how to protect integrity of any conversation about the electoral process. Here, we will be talking about how we have developed our policies and how we decide what the content that's in violation will be addressed, and how we are working, especially in terms of bringing high-quality content for people. When it comes to contextualization, I have some fresh news here. We just announced the 2022 elections tab. For those of you who used Twitter, know that on the Explore field we have content suggestions. So we will have, just as we had for COVID, a specific tab for the 2022 elections. And this tab will bring several pieces of content curated by an internal team at Twitter that's coincidentally called curatorship team. So it's important to stress that this team does not create any content. What they do is to collect from reliable accounts content that's for people to be more informed. All of this content was covered for this to not only be about the national elections, but also regional elections, so that we have fresh, important, relevant news from a specialized media outlet from, for example, Manaus. So we had training for these smaller media outlets just so that we have more diverse information. So what else will people find on these tabs? Moments, which is a compilation of everything that's relevant that's taking place during the elections, data about those conversations, Spaces, which is Twitter's new tool where specialists will be talking about the elections, and also a way to follow trustworthy sources about the theme and much more. So where to find all of this content that's being curated about the elections, as well as other topics? Where is all of this content appearing? Well, throughout the person's the user's experience on the platform. First of all, the Explore app, and now also notifications, which has been a way to educate people during critical moments. So we sent a push notification to everyone that had their notifications activated about the deadline to normalize their, regularize their situation with the Superior Electoral Court. Also, whenever people are using our search box, they receive a warning. For example, if there was a situation where there were rumors, where people were saying that voting licenses for people over 70 were being canceled. So first of all, we had a moment explaining all the facts relating to that, bringing results from the Superior Electoral Court, and also whenever you would seek título, which means the voter license, they would find all of that information right away. We also provided that context for any content that violates our civic rules, and we may flag that content as misleading, and we also steer people toward those reliable sources so that there's really friction for those people, including accurate information. Now, why are we approaching it this way? With everything that we do on Twitter, we try to study what will bring the best outcomes for our product. And what we saw was that by creating these experiences with quality content was that 73% of people understand this improves their experience with the platform. And almost 70% of people see that as a way to have access to high quality information and having narratives being better contextualized on Twitter. So we saw that this helps people understand the public debate that's going on Twitter. Another interesting piece of data that I have for you firsthand here is that in 2022 alone, this is just to give you an idea about the extent of the work of this team. In 2022 in Brazil alone, over 5,700 conversations were contextualized. And so there are combined on average almost 10 million views, so a very significant impact. In addition to that, within the topic of informing people with relevant information, Twitter will be flagging all the candidates' accounts. We will wait for the Superior Electoral Court to provide the final list of candidates, and those labels will say who is the candidate, what is he running for, if he is a state congressman, what party he's running for, and it's important to understand that this label is not optional and they can't remove it. This is something Twitter will be applying proactively. And the intention behind that is for people to identify their candidates on the platform so that they can follow them, learn about what they're proposing, and understanding what ideas they have for their state. It's also important to say that these labels will be, first of all, available only for candidates on the federal level, not for those on the state level at this point. So one place where you can find all information about the elections on Twitter that's already up, and continuing the conversation just so you understand how we are seeking to ensure Twitter does not give a platform to conversations intended to damage or to hurt citizens' rights when it comes to the elections. We have perennial policies. For example, we have policies to fight manipulation or fake news, which are constant, also for hate speech. So we use a combination of people and technology to ensure the enforcement of those policies. And when I talk about technology, it's not that it's automated. Actually, technology helps us to more quickly find the content, considering the scale, because that's something all platforms deal with. But the human action allows us to identify what is spam. Now, this policy is one that is enforced whenever we have some major civic moment. This is a policy that takes in consideration the Brazilian process so that we can better enforce the policy. And this policy has an extra layer of protection for these conversations. It's designed to address disinformation about the electoral process. process. So as Priscilla already said, disinformation about where to vote, what types of documents you need in hand, the day of the election, and also information that could undermine the reliability of the election process or the reliability of ballot boxes, for example. Anything in terms of disinformation like that will be in violation. So we will be able to flag that as disinformation with links to high-quality information, also reducing the reach of those posts, and if that is disinformation with high potential for damage, for causing damage, it might also be removed. But that will be the minority of the posts. Most of them will only have a reduction in scope and reach. It's also important to say that this policy is not the same for any type of disinformation. During the election, there will be accusations between candidates. So candidate A says that candidate B is corrupt or was involved in bribery schemes. This policy does not address that type of disinformation. For that, we have the election authority, which is the Superior Electoral Court, and they have a quicker channel where they can submit their decision. We have an extended team that will be working 24/7 during the elections to ensure that these regulations are enforced as quickly as possible.
Aí está exemplo de conteúdo que pode ser etiquetado com essa etiqueta de enganoso. E, por fim, acho que é importante ressaltar que o Twitter não permite propaganda eleitoral na plataforma, tá?
I think we should also mention that Twitter does not allow political ads on its platform. I think political ads are something that needs to be earned, and so political ads are not allowed on Twitter at all. And lastly, I'd like to invite you all to keep learning about this great moment in our democracy, our elections. We have a partnership with Superior Electoral Court, so I'd like to emphasize that we have a long-standing partnership with the court to promote certain content and to raise people's awareness and information. So that includes trustworthy ballot boxes, that includes how to get their voter registration in order. Some messages have already been created in partnership with the Superior Electoral Court. And just to wrap up, here's a survey we ran with of some people who use our platform, whether they are interested, and it turns out that they are. And they want to know about the candidates' proposals. So this confirms Twitter's role as a location where people can find excellent content. People want to know, for instance, what each candidate's proposals are for the economy, for the education system, for public health. And they do want to know about debates. They are interested in watching political debates. And so based on that, and in partnership with the Superior Electoral Court, we have run some campaigns to provide training to the candidates' teams and to bring these teams information about best practices, teach them about our civic policies, and to show them the features that our platform can offer, and to help them talk to potential voters. There's also a hashtag, translated it goes, Ask the Superior Electoral Court. So it's a very easy way for people to ask questions of the court. We're also going to have a chatbot that will answer questions about the elections. It'll have educational content. This will be available in August. And also the results of a survey that we we conducted,
56% das pessoas que usam o Twitter têm o
56%
hábito
of
de
people
sempre
who
checar
use Twitter
fatos, 30% às vezes, mas nós
habitually
temos uma
fact
porcentagem de
check.
pessoas que nunca checam. Então,
But we
existe
do have
ainda
a
uma
percentage of
necessidade
people who
grande
never
de educar
fact
as
check
pessoas
as
sobre
well.
isso. Então,
So
nós
it's
estamos
important to educate
apoiando
people about that as well.
projetos do Aos Fatos da agência
So
Lupa,
we
sobre
are
educação midiática, que está em andamento, vai
we
ser
are
lançado
supporting
em breve.
projects
O Twitter
by
também vai lançar
Lupa and
campanhas
Os Fatos
próprias de educação midiática com apoio de especialistas como o Instituto
to
Palavra
press
Aberta. Isso vai acontecer a partir de agosto,
agencies.
vocês vão ver essas campanhas no ar. E por fim, para encerrar,
You're going
mas
to
não
see
menos
some
importante, a gente
campaigns
anunciou hoje os
going live
emojis.
soon.
Os
And
emojis que o
last but
Twitter
not
está
least,
lançando para
we
incentivar
have
as pessoas a
announced
engajar
today
no
a number of
processo eleitoral.
emojis
Então,
that we
já está
are
disponível
publishing
agora, eleições
to help
2022.
encourage
A
people
partir
to
dos
vote.
debates, vamos colocar disponíveis
So,
a
as
hashtag
of the debates, we're
DebateBR.
going to
Debates
have
no
the
Brasil vai aparecer automaticamente
Brazilian
o emoji.
debates,
E por fim, para incentivar as pessoas a
hashtags, and
participarem no
emojis
dia
to
das
encourage
eleições,
people to
vai ter o
participate
emoji de
on
participação,
election day.
eu votei, confirma e bora votar.
So there's going to
Então, com
be
isso,
a
eu
number
encerro
of
minha fala,
different,
convido vocês a seguir o
like
Twitter
different
Brasil para saber mais novidades.
emojis, like
Obrigada.
I voted and so on. Thank you.
Super obrigado, Daniele. Só muito rapidamente antes de
Thank
passar aqui
you,
para a
Daniele.
próxima convidada, acho
Before
acho que tem esse
we move on
desafio
to our
das
next guest,
plataformas. Acho que
I
existe
think
uma
there's
relevância nas
a
iniciativas
huge
que foram
challenge
mostradas
here,
aqui.
but
Acho
it's
que isso
very
também
important as
responde
well.
pouco ao tamanho que essas
And I think
empresas
this
conquistaram no ambiente da internet. Então,
responds
acho que
to
aquela
the sheer
perspectiva que a gente
size
tinha de uma
that
internet mais
these companies
centralizada, onde
have,
todos falavam com todos, etc., acabou sendo atropelado
claimed,
por
really.
negócios. E aí acho que é importante a gente dizer também que existem
important
temas,
for us to
falando
say
até com a Pri, né?
that
Assim,
there are
às
certain
vezes tem
topics
entreveros, às vezes colabora, etc., mas é importante um debate
that
franco. E tem tópicos
sometimes
que muitas vezes
there's work to be
não
done,
são,
but sometimes we can work together.
incorporados e debatidos nas políticas das plataformas.
And
e que
there
são
are
maneiras
certain
radicais que a gente
topics
observa,
that are
de ajustar e remediar
that really
determinadas
grow
situações
from
graves
the
que
conversations we
acontecem no
have.
debate público,
And of
principalmente
course there are
em
some very
relação
serious
à
issues that occur as
desinformação.
well.
Então, a discussão sobre o modelo
And
de negócios, acho que a
we can
discussão sobre
fight that type
transparência
of
algorítmica, como é
disinformation.
feito o feed, economia da
That
atenção, tem uma
includes
série de coisas
the
que eu acho que são importantes que a
algorithm.
gente leve à
We
frente e
can
debata
raise awareness
de
about the
maneira
algorithm,
super
about
transparente. E além disso,
policies,
acho que uma das
and
coisas
about
que aí
other
cabe a
topics
todos
as
nós,
well.
a gente enquanto sociedade,
And I think
pensar
we, as a
criativamente
society,
novas formas de
can
explorar o ambiente
be
digital.
creative
A gente
in
não pode pra
how
sempre, a
we
gente
can
sabe que não vai ser
explore
pra
the
sempre,
digital
essas coisas, a gente
environment.
estava falando disso também, né? Não faz 10 anos que a gente está lidando com esse tipo de
It hasn't
fenômeno
even
que a
been
gente
10
lida
years
hoje.
since
Então,
we
são
started
dinâmicas,
working
principalmente
with this
no
type
mundo
of
digital,
technology.
são muito
So,
se alteram muito
we know that
rapidamente,
things
você tem
change
dinheiro,
very
tem interesses
quickly in the
políticos,
digital
interesses
world,
econômicos e novidades tecnológicas que
especially
fazem
when
com que
there's
a gente
economic interests
precise
involved.
lidar com outros ambientes, outras ferramentas, outras
And
plataformas. Então acho
we
que uma
very
maneira
often
criativa
will
da gente
need
voltar
to
a
learn to
observar a
work
internet
with
como
other
espaço aberto,
platforms.
possível de
So we need to look
atuações
at
que
the
sejam
internet as
complementares
an
a essas
open
atuações,
space,
né, de grandes empresas,
a
grandes
space
plataformas.
where
É
we can
importante
all
também para um debate sobre o
engage
futuro da liberdade de expressão no ambiente
have
digital. Então,
debates
queria
that
agora
are going
passar
to be very
para a
important
Heloísa
in
Massaro, do Internet
shaping
Lab,
our
organização da
future.
sociedade civil, que faz
I'd
também
now
um
like to
excelente
invite
trabalho,
Eloisa
tanto
from
em relação a
Internet
direitos
Lab, a
digitais,
civil
como
society
monitorando
organization that
também
does great
os
work
processos de legislação
auditing
eleitoral em relação à tecnologia.
electoral
Então, super
processes.
obrigado pela presença, Elo.
So thank you very much, Eloisa.
Obrigada, Pajé. Queria cumprimentar
Thank
todo mundo
you,
que está na
Pajé.
mesa,
I'd
TC,
like
Meta,
to
Twitter.
say a very warm hello to
É
everyone
um prazer
here.
estar aqui hoje.
The
Eu acho
Court,
que,
Meta,
enfim,
Twitter,
mudando
and
um pouco,
Katie.
né, um foco depois
I want to
de termos
change
representantes
tack
do
a little
TSE e das
bit.
plataformas falando, eu
After
acho que eu quero
all,
voltar um
the
pouquinho numa questão que o Pajé trouxe, que eu acho que é muito
information brought by the
importante quando a
court
gente está
and the
pensando
platforms.
em discurso de atores políticos, que é
When
o
we
quanto é
talk
difícil
about
traçar essa linha
speech
entre o legítimo e o não
and
legítimo,
dialogue
pensando
from
nos
political
dois pontos que o
actors,
Pajé trouxe, né? O
I
primeiro
want
é
to go back to 2 points that
que
Pajé
o
mentioned.
discurso político, ele é um discurso,
first
ou melhor,
is
o
that
discurso de atores políticos, ele é um discurso que tem um impacto significativo,
Messages
seja em termos de validar
from
narrativas,
political
seja em termos
actors
de incitar
are
comportamentos,
very,
seja em termos de
very
gerar
significant.
situações.
and they are very
por outro
powerful.
lado, o discurso
They can
político também é
lead to different
discurso essencial para a
situations.
democracia.
On the other hand,
E eu acho que a gente
political
também precisa levar em
dialogue is
consideração
essential for
que num país
democracy.
como o Brasil,
And
a
we need
gente
to
tem
consider
histórico de
that
cerceamento
a
de
country like
discurso
Brazil
político, precisa ser
does
levado em
have a
conta quando a
history
gente está pensando
of
em onde a gente
censorship.
vai traçar linhas do
So
que é
we
legítimo
need
ou não, ou de
to
como
think very carefully
traçar
about
medidas
where we
que
draw
visam
certain
garantir a integridade
lines,
do espaço público.
because we
E eu
need
estou
to
falando
protect
isso
the
porque
integrity
uma das questões
of
que muito me
public
preocupa
spaces.
quando a gente entra em
And I say
temas
this
de
because one of the
desinformação,
topics
integridade
that
eleitoral,
really
e
worries
discurso
me
de agentes políticos é que
when we
em
talk about
situações
the elections
excepcionais,
and
né, ou em situações
political actors,
em momentos históricos excepcionais, a gente começa a
when
traçar
we are
políticas que vão
in
valer para depois desses momentos e que
exceptional
possam pôr em risco a liberdade de
moments in
expressão.
history,
Então, eu acho que essa tem que ser
we
o
are
primeiro,
going to create
na verdade,
policies
pano de
that
fundo
are
de
going
qualquer
to
discussão que esteja olhando
live
para a integridade
long
eleitoral e
past
para
these
garantir
moments.
e para como olhar para esse discurso de atores
So we need
políticos,
to
né, que
be
é a
careful when we
gente
look
não
at these
pensar em
messages
soluções ou em medidas que sejam muito
being
casuísticas,
said,
que consigam
and
sobreviver
the
para além daquele
policies that we
momento sem
create
colocar em
based
risco
on
outros
it.
direitos.
We
E
can't
daí, eu acho que, pensando um
we
pouco mais na
can't
perspectiva
be,
institucional, né, como que a gente remedia, ou como que a gente olha para esses
we need to
discursos
think
políticos, acho que a gente
carefully,
tem
and we
dois
can't
pontos,
be
né? Por um lado, a gente tem a atuação do setor público, e daí eu estou falando muito para
flippant
além do
when we
programa de enfrentamento à
design
desinformação do
these
tribunal, eu
policies.
estou olhando principalmente para o direito eleitoral.
I'm
Quando a gente tá
thinking
falando de atores
specifically
políticos, grande
about
parte desses atores
electoral
políticos
law
são
here,
candidatos,
because
e eu
a
acho que quando a gente
great
está
number of
pensando
these
na legitimidade
agents and
ou no
actors,
que é
they
legítimo
are
ou não, eu
candidates.
acho que
So
a primeira coisa que, na verdade, tem que ser levada em consideração é que existem
when we
regras
decide
na
whether
legislação
something is or
eleitoral
isn't
que vão
legitimate,
regular esse
we need to
discurso de certa
remember
forma,
that there
né?
are
A
rules
TSE, quando ele atualizou a
that
resolução de propaganda eleitoral ano
guide
passado,
whether or not
ele incluiu
certain
previsão de
messages
fatos
are
altamente
legal.
inverídicos. Não
So the
são
Superior
permitidos em
Electoral
peças de
Court
propaganda de candidatos.
established a rule
Então, a legislação
that
eleitoral também
said
tem uma
that
série de
certain
regras
ads are
e
not
estruturas
permitted
normativas
during
que
certain
regulam divulgação de
periods.
conteúdo, ou que
There
regulam
are
casos
guidelines
de
establishing
propaganda irregular, ou até
when
mesmo, né, chegando em limites de casos de
illegal
abuso de poder.
ads are
Então,
run
isso é uma coisa
and
que
what
tem
should
que
be
ser levada em
done
consideração
in
quando a gente
case
tá
they
falando
are
desse
run and
discurso.
so on.
Mas, por outro lado, a gente também tem o setor privado.
On the
né?
other
Porque,
hand, we also have the
eu também
private
acho
sector.
importante pensar o porquê que
It's
é tão
important
importante
to
trazer as
think
plataformas do setor privado para essa
about
conversa, que é que
why it's so
existe
crucial to
limite
bring
até
the
onde
platforms into
que
this
o que a
discussion,
legislação eleitoral consegue chegar,
because
ou
there are
que o TSE
limits
consegue
to
chegar com a
where
normativa que a gente tem hoje.
the Superior
De certa
Electoral
forma,
Court
quando a gente
can
tá
reach.
pensando, as eleições estão aí daqui, o período eleitoral começa daqui
The
um
elections,
mês,
or the
e
electoral period begins in,
as
what, a month
plataformas, elas
from
estão
now?
numa posição
But
que ela
the
é muito
platforms
central e
are in
muito
a
estratégica quando a
position
gente está pensando
that is
no poder
extremely
de controle de certos
strategic
discursos, tanto no
when we talk
tempo
about
e na resposta rápida de
controlling
controle ou
messages,
de
and they can
manutenção,
respond
enfim,
very
qualquer
quickly.
tipo de ação que seja feita sobre
They can
certos
take
discursos.
action very quickly
Então,
on certain political
por isso
messages.
que é muito importante estabelecer um diálogo e
So it is
trazer
extremely
também esses
important to
atores pra
establish a
mesa, né? E
dialogue
daí,
and
quando a
to
gente tá
bring
pensando
these
em
actors
discursos de
to
atores
the table,
políticos,
to the conversation.
que é o limite do que é aceitável ou não,
So
né?
what
Onde
is
tá
the
o limite
limit
do que
of what is or
legítimo, não?
isn't
Eu acho que tem duas
acceptable
coisas que são
or
muito
legitimate?
importantes, que um é quando a gente
Well,
tá
there are
pensando,
two very
por
important
um lado, é a
issues at
questão da
hand.
violência, e não só a
One is
violência
the issue of
online, mas
violence,
também
and not
o
just
risco que
online
tem de
violence,
violência, e que
but
a gente já tá
the
vendo
risk that you
acontecer, a
run
partir de
of
discursos
suffering
políticos,
physical
risco da
violence.
violência offline, que nem
There
a
is a
Tati disse,
serious
isso é uma
risk
coisa
of offline
que a
violence.
sociedade civil vem levantando há
That's
muito
something that civil
pouco.
society has
É
been
porque
talking about
isso
for a while
vem
now.
aparecendo, de certa forma.
This
Por
has
outro
been
lado,
showing
a gente
through
tem
for a
a própria
while.
ameaça à própria estrutura
And we
democrática,
have
né, ao próprio processo
the
democrático que tem que ser
threat
levado,
to the
em
very
consideração.
structure of our
E
democracy.
eu acho que para, enfim, fazer uma fala bem curta,
I just
encerrar, o que eu queria
want
trazer
to be very
que
brief. So
do
I
lado do
will
Internet Lab, uma coisa que a gente
conclude
fez
by
nos
saying that
últimos meses
the
foi
Internet
tentar
Lab has,
organizar
over the past few months,
todas as políticas de
been
integridade
trying to
eleitoral que as plataformas de
organize and
internet
bring
têm.
together
Então,
all sorts
reunir
of different
todas elas,
policies
buscar organizar elas de uma forma que seja acessível e
and to
facilmente
organize
consumível
them in
pelas
a way
pessoas.
that is
Esse
easily
projeto vai ser lançado
accessible
em breve.
and
E uma das coisas que a
readable
gente foi
by regular
percebendo
people.
é que
This will be
quando a
published
gente está
soon.
falando da regulação desses
And when we talk about regulating messages posted by political actors with a mind to the integrity of the electoral process, these rules are still very sparse. So it's hard to access them in a way that is friendly. This includes navigating through many different blog posts and websites. It is a rather tiresome process. On the other hand, based on discussions that we had internally about rules, examples, and structures, we felt a need for examples. And so this is still a gap that we have observed during this process. Very often the examples are either unclear or insufficient. We're often not sure whether the example restricts the rule or law or if it doesn't. And this is one of the measures that comes to mind when we think of transparency and making this process clearer. What can be taken into account based on the context? Because electoral messages posted by political actors, they often have impacts and risks and meanings very different from one another, often because of a very minimal change in context. A tiny change in context can often mean a huge impact, an offline impact, that wouldn't exist if not for that tiny bit of context. So these are some of the aspects that we see when we observe these topics. Something else, when we look at these issues, and again highlighting the integrity of the electoral process, there are often facts that we don't know whether they are or are not truthful, but they feed into other misleading pieces of information. So it's not a simple matter of saying whether something is true or false out of context. Often, these narratives support beliefs that are very long-lived. And just as it's not all about disinformation, so we should also highlight that it's not all about removal. We should think about a scope of solutions, and I think Priscilla and Daniele mentioned many of these. Demonetization, reducing reach are also topics we should consider. Thank you.
Obrigado, Elo. Acho que vou passar direto, então, depois para a gente ter tempinho para conversar, para Kate Hartmann, que diretora de Tecnologia e Democracia do IRI, para complementar
the director for
nossa mesa.
Democracy at IRI, to add a little more to our conversation. Welcome.
Thank you. Tudo bem, but forgive me, I'm going to have to do this in English. So if you need translation, there is, you can pick up headphones. I want to thank everybody here on stage, my former colleagues, Priscilla and Danny, who I worked with at Meta, where I was there for 10 years working on a lot of these issues, and the Electoral Court and Article 19 and Internet Lab, who have been very important partners over the years in this work. It's not my 20th time in Brazil, but I think my 12th. Since 2013, working on elections, and I was really excited when I started working at IRI in January that I think Humberto gave me all of 3 days after my first day to say, hey, I want you to come to Brazil. We wanted to try to work on mis and disinformation around the election, and so I jumped at it. And I'd like to zoom out briefly before we go to questions and discussion. One of the things that I think is important to recognize about why days like today are really important is that this does take an all-of-society approach. It's not something just the platforms can do, it's not just something regulators can do, it's not just something any one civil society organization can do. And we are in the middle of developing new societal norms, fighting new ways that people are trying to disrupt this process. And so having these conversations, disagreements, are important as part of this dialogue. I also want to recognize just the court. Amongst all the electoral commissions I've worked with, you are some of the most proactive around electoral commissions in working with so many different partners, of really being at the forefront of trying to fight this. And I really think it's an example that the rest of the world can really take to heart, and know I tell them that too when I talk to them. A couple of things though is that while it's important to know what big tech companies like Meta and Twitter are doing, there is a lot of platforms online and offline that are being used to spread information, both good and bad, about the electoral process. And one of the trends that I'm seeing is how people are using social media messaging apps, whether it's also watching more video, live audio. This is constantly changing. And so it's important to remain diligent and not just be assuming that what happened in the previous election, even just in 2020, is even how it's going to work in this one. I think too that that's going to make your work harder. It makes all of our work a lot harder, because it is harder to identify where disinformation might be being spread and how to combat that. And so that means we need to keep looking at different tools that we can build and ways that we can try to be more proactive in getting authoritative information to people, and to prepare them for the types of disinformation they might run into as they are throughout the electoral process. This has been mentioned by a couple of other folks before, but the challenges are not just going to be around elections. They happen before elections, they happen after elections, they happen about our political discourse overall. And so it's important for this to be something that after Election Day is not just shut off or stopped, but is continued to be working on. There's always more that all of us can do. There's more that the tech companies can do. There's more that many others can do. And I say this with bias, as having been somebody who oftentimes had to confront that. And I think things like more transparency are always going to be more important, always to be building. And it's important to hold each other accountable over time for that, and to be pushing more and more to discover how we do that. But a theme throughout of what I've heard today as well, and always in these discussions, is how really impossible some of these trade-offs are. Being able to protect speech while keeping people safe can be some of the hardest discussions to have about how you prioritize what is allowed or not allowed on a platform, what the penalties are for what they have to say or not say. And that's why these conversations are important, because drawing those lines are not easy. Otherwise, we all would have done it a long, long time ago. And the last thing I'll just say is that 2024 scares me. It's going to be a year, for the first time ever, that you're not only going to have a US presidential election, but national level elections in India, Indonesia, Ukraine, Taiwan, Mexico, the United Kingdom, the European Parliament, Brazil will have their elections, and many, many other countries. It's the first time that many large countries have gone to election in the same year. And I'm a dork, I did the math back in the 1950s. That's going to be a lot of areas for tech companies, civil society, others to have to monitor, to have to track. And it's times like that where bad actors can really try to exploit what is happening, because it will be hard for those trying to defend our electoral systems to be concentrating in so many different places. So as much as you may want to take a break after these elections, I encourage you to do a short one, but then we're gonna have to get right back to work because we have quite a couple years ahead of us. Thank you, Article 19, for partnering with us on this event. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll be happy to take questions now.
Obrigado, Kate. Kate
Thank you,
apavorou a gente.
Katie.
Está preocupado já com a eleição de
Katie
22.
just terrified us. We're
que não tinha nem pensado
concerned about 2022. We weren't even thinking about
Então a gente
2024.
tem mais
So
tempinho
we still
aqui.
have a little bit more time here. We already polled for questions. We can go a little bit over 6 o'clock. So I would like to open the floor for anyone who has questions or comments or suggestions. Brenda, if you could please start. I would like to suggest, because we have a microphone that's outside, if we could have a line back there, we'll have a round of interventions, and then we'll come back to the round table for everyone to answer, okay? Thank you, guys. Hi, good morning. I'm Brenda Cunha with Article 19 within the Program of Access to Information and Transparency. I'd like to thank all of you, first of all, and I have a major question when you talk about content moderation and freedom of expression. There was an episode that took place just a few moments ago as Priscilla talked about Meta's initiatives in terms of transparency and linking that with what Paget mentioned about transparency. As I was watching you, I took a picture and tried to post that on Instagram. I tagged all of the institutions here with us, and also mentioning your names, but my content could not be published. I was prevented from publishing it, from posting it. I just got a message back saying that some of my content were sensitive to the community, so it wouldn't be posted. And that brought me to a very critical question about the issues coming up in the moderation being done by automatic machines, and also ways for people who have their content blocked to really come forward. It is well known, and even some of those here, we had someone here in Brazil, Francis who talked about terrorist content that was taken down, and this brings us to the realization that we do have to counter the issue of disinformation and everything that comes with hate speech as well, which relates to everything that we said here. And considering all of these problems, this little event that I just faced and everything that you guys are saying, I wanted to see what has Instagram been doing, especially during this moment, to try to solve this issue, ensuring that freedom of expression can be minimally enforced during times of election, overcoming these problems and moderation failures, and the lack of channels to challenge those content when it's taken down. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what she said, and I would also like to ask Priscilla. Francis Hauge also brought a few questions about how much Meta has been investing in artificial intelligence in other languages than English. We don't know how much has been made available in terms of AI and Portuguese, considering that we are the third country in user numbers for both Instagram and WhatsApp, and we do not know how much is being invested in. As a consequence, we are seeing cases of false positives, just as the one she just mentioned. We're seeing that within our organizations, we would sometimes report LGBTQ-phobic content being removed, whereas the content that we were reporting was still available on the profile of that person who had posted that. We had our denouncement being taken down, and we mentioned, I think, 16,000 people around the world working on moderation, and I would like to know if you have the number for Brazil specifically. Thank you.
Obrigado, Humberto.
Thank you, Humberto. Denise?
Obrigada.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Denise with Article 19. I would like to thank all our panelists. It's great to hear all efforts and especially everything that's being thought about that issue. And I wanted to point out an interview by Maria Hessa to newspaper Folha de São Paulo. This is a journalist who's been persecuted, and she won the Nobel Prize yesterday, and she says that these platforms have a responsibility with democracies around the world, and that CSOs, journalism, and in a way, even part of those online platforms have a lack of their own agenda in terms of what to do. She says right now, we don't really know what to do. But our next step is to first mitigate and reinforce the role of those denouncers in the sense where society has to respond to what's being produced by algorithms, by the market, and by the need to produce more efficient devices for monitoring and flagging. So when Katie mentions that elections will take place in places like India and Ukraine, what comes with that is our future itself. So our conversation is so strategic and so important, as important as that about climate change, for example. And I think that the test for Brazil is fundamental. So I wanted to bring this thought to everyone on the round table, because this will have an impact on the world at a time when people producing the information are federal authorities. It's not that we're seeing a generic disinformation process. We're seeing an imbalanced process where people in high office are actually some of the most important promoters of that type of content. So I wanted to hear more from you guys about this time. Thank you, Denise.
Vou aproveitar pouquinho o gancho da Denise e de outros colegas. Primeiro também agradecer mais uma vez o evento, né? Está sendo maravilhoso. Principalmente essa oportunidade de a gente debater de uma forma muito franca, honesta, realmente pensando em soluções propositivas para esse cenário que a gente está vivendo. Assim, eu acho que o evento também vem numa semana que parece que foi colocado para ser essa semana, né? A gente começou a semana com um grande ataque ao nosso processo democrático de uma forma muito intensa e desproporcional assim, em relação a tudo que a gente tinha visto. E aí a minha pergunta em relação a isso, né? O Facebook ele tem uma iniciativa, a medida de não necessariamente verificar atores políticos. A gente também tem esse debate que a Luísa trouxe, da gente ter o cuidado com o cerceamento do debate político.
Priscilla mentioned the importance of not restricting political messages.
Digamos, minar essa desinformação.
So I want to see if we can find a way, let's say, to undermine the fake news and bring the political actors to accountability and not necessarily make the content get removed, but talk about what we can do and prepare ourselves for these massive attacks that we are increasingly observing. And I'd like to congratulate the Superior Electoral Court for very quickly responding to this attack. So I guess it's not so much a question as it is a comment that we saw a significant situation here, a case study really, where the court was able to use all of its power to fight the fake news. Thank you, Rica.
Posso depois vamos encerrar as inscrições aqui para a gente ter 5 minutinhos aqui na mesa para as falas finais.
We're going to close the floor after in a few minutes.
Vocês duas a gente vai ter
So,
essa extensão.
Because we do have to keep a timeline. So if you have any questions, make sure to make your way to the microphone right now.
A minha é para vocês duas de novo.
Well, my question is to Meta and Twitter again. About content moderation, as you mentioned, it's so important. At Intervozes, we had a study that we conducted about how the platforms are dealing with fake news. And we have seen some small steps forward. But I wonder if the content moderation that you run for users, does this also happen for advertisers? Because you mentioned the ad library. How is this built, this classification? How do you define what is or isn't legitimate? And you told me that you're looking into it and you're using fact checkers to see whether the news is true or false. But do you do that for advertisers as well? And if so, how?
Legal, gente, super obrigado. Eu vou fazer uma sugestão aqui.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Fazer uma
I have
rodada
a
final
suggestion here
daqui indo para lá.
to have a final run-through of our roundtable members. So, Katie, please start with your final thoughts, and if you'd like to answer any questions that were brought up, and then we will take turns. Just to make sure that no one forgets, and to get it out of the way. Thank you so very much to everyone, especially to everyone from Article 19 and the IRI. You were absolutely instrumental. Without this partnership, none of this would be possible. And this event actually marks the beginning of one of our activities here that we're working on. And this is not going to end when the elections happen. This type of vigilance needs to be constant. We need to always remain vigilant and protect our democracy, hopefully in 2023, and hopefully we'll make it to 2024. So, Katie, first, please.
Yeah, I have just a couple of remarks, I promise, very brief. One is there's an interesting tension between wanting the platforms to be aggressive in fighting mis and disinformation and how that actually works in practice of building those tools and how accurate those tools can be. And one of the things I personally dealt with a lot when I was at the company, at Meta, was this balance of how many false positives are you willing to have or not. And I've been hearing this a lot from our partners in Ukraine who are suffering from it, and others who are like, we're just trying to do good work. Why are you blocking our content? Why are they blocking ours? Why is it not more accurate? And I do think more conversations about the sort of the difference between having the policy and how well it can be executed on is an important one to continue to have and to discuss, because that can be a big challenge, and you end up kind of being stuck between a rock and a hard place of we want to do more, but if we do more, we might have more false positives. So how do we find that balance? When you look at some of the comments around the global investment in all of this, I think there does need to be a lot more global investment. I do worry with the economic downturn what that is going to mean in terms of not just the big companies, but the smaller platforms and how much they're going to be investing in this space. But it's important too to understand sometimes the nuance in what is being said. One of the stats Francis likes to use a lot is very specific to the amount of money that was being spent a couple of years ago on product interventions. It doesn't necessarily take into account everything, and I'll let Priscilla talk about that more, but there's a lot of times nuance that gets lost in some of these conversations. And I think it's important to try to recognize that sometimes and make sure that we're all kind of talking about the same thing. Last thing I'll just say is I think there's a lot to be learned about how mis and disinformation was fought as Russia invaded Ukraine. There's a lot of really great practices around the governments being very forthcoming to citizens and others to be prepared for Russia's disinformation around the invasion and around the war, around the rapid response, which I think we did see this week here in Brazil. And so while the election is very close, and that may not be completely possible to do ahead of this election, thinking about that as you go into future ones, and how do you continue to keep educating citizens so they become smarter consumers of news and information that they see is going to be really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Bom, eu acho que, enfim, eu queria primeiro dizer que eu concordo
I'd
muito com a questão que a Kate trouxe.
First and foremost, say that I agree wholeheartedly with what Katie has said. When these discussions are atomized, and we have to decide whether or not to remove something, that makes these decisions actually more difficult. The equation, so to speak, between the demand for removing more content and the challenges in dealing with the scale of content that these global platforms have to deal with, it is really a challenge. So I agree with what Katie said. And she also said something that really goes hand in hand with something that I mentioned. There are risks of democratic defeat. So one of these risks is in creating policies that will outlive this current moment. And so the policies need to be discussed thoroughly between many different actors. And to respond to Denise and Liz's questions,
eu acho que não dá para pensar só nas políticas privadas nas plataformas. Eu acho que a gente também tem que pensar via direito eleitoral. O que a gente tem no direito eleitoral hoje, e não só em termos de mecanismos rápidos de remoção de conteúdo, mas também o que as figuras de abuso de poder político, de abuso de poder econômico e de uso de meios de comunicação social significam num cenário de comunicação digital.
and what that means in a scenario of digital communications.
Que é mais que urgente, assim,
And all that
mês da campanha eleitoral,
through the challenge
a gente não vai ter alteração legislativa, onde
we are
vai poder fazer, já está
1 month away from the elections, practically. So that means that we are not going to see any kind of legal changes right now. The law is locked in.
Posto para lidar com situações de crise.
What do we have
Quais são as medidas que as plataformas têm para lidar com situações de crise? Quais são protocolos? Existem protocolos para situações onde esse risco seja iminente? Como que o contexto é levado em consideração? E para isso eu acho que é muito importante também pensar que nem tudo é sobre desinformação. Essas situações elas vão muito além de desinformação. As narrativas são muito mais complexas do que a gente está falando apenas
much more complex than a simple
eu acho que tem uma última
piece
coisa
of fake
que eu
news.
acho que é legal acrescentar e que apareceu um pouco
Something
na
else
mesa,
I think
que é que
is
quando a
also
gente está
interesting
falando
that
dessas
I'd like to
narrativas,
add.
dessas situações,
When we talk about these
risco
narratives
também
and
muito
situations,
grande
there is
é acabar
a significant
amplificando elas
risk
na hora de
of
criticar
amplifying them
ou de
when we try to criticize
querer
them.
rebater elas. Então, eu
might
acho que esse é um
try
cuidado
to
muito
knock
grande
them down,
que a sociedade civil
and
tem
in
que
so
ter, que as
doing,
empresas de mídia
actually,
têm que ter, que é, muitas vezes essas narrativas,
them
elas
grow.
acabam sendo amplificadas e
Many
ganhando
of these
tração
narratives
exatamente
gain
no processo de
traction
se buscar combater elas.
precisely during
E esse é um cuidado essencial nessas situações de crise também. Enfim, eu queria agradecer de novo aos colegas de mesa,
So
agradecer
that's
ao
something we need to be on the lookout for.
pelo convite.
And thank you once again to all my colleagues here. And
quero agradecer o artigo
and
19
the
a
IRI,
todos os
Article 19.
organizadores, todos os meus
I would
colegas
also like
da
to
mesa.
thank Article 19 and the IRI and everyone
Como
here.
já foi muito dito aqui, as eleições estão aí.
And as
Então, eu vejo
everyone
que
keeps saying, the
é
elections are
necessário
right
que a
around
gente
the
atue em
corner.
rede,
Everyone
a
is
gente
right.
busque
So we need
desenvolver
to
ações em conjunto.
Work on finding
E eu acredito
joint
que aqui,
solutions.
deixar recado aqui, esforço
I'd like
que
to
nós
leave a
precisamos
message
realizar,
here.
talvez no ambiente digital,
There's
buscar
an effort that we need to
fortalecer o
undertake,
ecossistema
and that is to
atores
strengthen
relevantes
the
brasileiros.
ecosystem
A
with
maioria das
relevant
plataformas
Brazilian
digitais hoje,
actors. So in
elas vêm de
addition
fora.
to the
Eu acho que a reflexão é como que a gente se estrutura com a nossa cultura,
because most of these
nosso
platforms
modo,
come from abroad.
E a gente construa isso
So we
de uma
need
maneira
to build
rápida para essas eleições. Acho que
something quickly
muito
for
pra
these
caminhar nesse
elections.
sentido.
We have a long,
Uma
long
das
way
coisas
to
que eu
go.
acho que posso colocar aqui
And something
e
that
que pode
I
parecer
think
muito prático,
I can say here, and it
operacional,
might seem very
mas nós precisamos
practical
de dados,
and hands in the dirt,
a gente
but
precisa de muito mais
we really
informação,
need
muito
data.
mais pesquisa,
We need
e eu acredito
surveys.
que nós podemos estimular ainda
And
para
I
essas
think
eleições.
we can encourage
A gente
that
precisa da
for
academia
these elections. We
atuando aí
need
com pesquisas mais
the
profundas.
universities
A gente
working
precisa de
to
organizações da sociedade
establish
civil,
and
a gente
carry
precisa
out
de
more
imprensa.
in-depth surveys and
Estimular
research.
esse apoio, eu
We
acho
need
que
civil
é
society,
papel
we
de
need the
todos que estão
press.
aqui, né? Acho que desde o
I
setor
think
público, as grandes
this is a
plataformas,
job for everyone here,
e com informações, eu acho
including
que
the
a gente consegue se
platforms.
mover mais rápido, de
And
maneira mais
with
estratégica.
more
nesse
information,
sentido,
we can
no
move more
momento que a
quickly
gente
and
está
more
agora.
strategically.
É isso, quero agradecer a apresentação de
That's
todos.
what I wanted to
Obrigado.
do. Thank you, everyone, for your input.
Imagina. Eu queria pegar um gancho da sua fala, Thiago, só para
Tiago, I want to just open a brief parenthesis.
Usem.
Twitter has an
Isso
open
ouro.
API. Please use
para
it.
acadêmicos, para pesquisadores,
It's
para
for
organizações
researchers, for
não
academics,
governamentais.
for
A filosofia do
NGOs.
Twitter está
It
em torno
is
de
Twitter's
quando
core
vocês
philosophy.
produzem material de
When
qualidade,
you create
a
quality
gente também
content,
ganha.
we
A gente
also
vai entender
gain.
quais são os gaps. A gente
We
tem um time
learn what our
de
gaps are.
research, de pesquisa, que
We have a
mapeia
research
essas
team that
pesquisas que são feitas
maps
com a API
out
e que leva para a
these
gente discutir, entender
studies
como a gente pode
conducted
melhorar.
using our
Então, só
API.
queria ressaltar isso.
And they produce
Dentro
reports about
de
how
tudo
we
que
can
foi falado
improve.
com
So
muita
I want to
qualidade
point
e
that out.
muita precisão, eu queria
Now, to
ecoar
answer
a questão que a Elo trouxe,
something
da gente
that many
deixar
people have
de fazer
mentioned,
uma
I want to
discussão
echo
atomizada
what
sobre
Eloisa said.
desinformação. A gente não pode fazer com que a
can't
discussão seja apenas sobre
limit ourselves
remoção
to
de conteúdo. Remoção de
binary
conteúdo
or
não dá conta
atomic
da complexidade
discussions.
e do fenômeno.
It's not
Tá?
just a matter
claro
of
que uma
removing
situação de potencial
information.
de dano é uma
Of
opção na
course,
mesa,
when we
mas
look
não pode
about,
ser a única.
or when we look at
Nunca vai
the
resolver
potential
simplesmente remover
for
conteúdo na
risk
plataforma.
reduction,
Nós precisamos
it's
de
not as
olhar
easy
360.
as removing
As plataformas
something
têm
from the
o seu papel
platform.
a
We need
cumprir nisso,
a
sim, em
360-degree
ser
view.
criativas, em produzir
platforms need to
tecnologia
be
que
creative,
possa ajudar,
and they
principalmente
create
atores
technology
maliciosos,
that can
aquelas pessoas
help.
que monetizam, que
But
ganham dinheiro com
we-
isso, que tem
we need
outras
to work
intenções,
together
não aquela pessoa que
to
desavisadamente foi lá e
fight
postou. É claro que
the
essa também tem um
malicious
papel educacional para
actors.
fazer. Então, como as plataformas podem fazer melhor
So,
seu desempenho?
I want to
Investindo
know
em tecnologia,
how
sendo criativas,
the
entendendo como
platforms
essas coisas
can,
operam com a ajuda, claro, de
can
acadêmicos, de
work
especialistas,
more
que a gente
effectively.
consiga
And I have one answer for
combater esse
that,
comportamento
and that's
nocivo
by
na
increasing
plataforma,
funding.
mas de uma maneira de longo
But
prazo, estruturada. A
I
remoção
want to
ela
know
enche
how
o
we can
gelo.
do that in the
Ela
long
não resolve
term,
a nossa questão.
because
A gente precisa pensar quais são os resultados de longo prazo, qual é a
we can't
cultura
look for
de consumo de
stopgap
informação, de
solutions.
responsabilidade
We need
que a
to
gente precisa ter na
investigate our
internet.
culture
E aí
of
entram outros atores que podem nos ajudar,
data
principalmente na parte de
consumption,
responsabilidade.
how
Uma
people,
coisa que eu fico incomodada é quando
what
colocam
people
as
search
plataformas
for
como
on the
as
web
pessoas,
and
as
why,
empresas
and
que
how
têm que ser as
they
arbitrárias da verdade.
respond
Como
to
cidadã eu
what
não
they find.
defenderia isso.
As a
Eu não gostaria
citizen,
que empresas privadas
I wouldn't
definissem o que
want
é verdade e não é
private
verdade. Claro que
companies to
existe
define
papel de
what is
moderação a ser
true
feito,
and what is not.
mas outros atores
Private
precisam
companies
ajudar a
cannot be
entender
arbiters of
também
truth.
quais são essas intervenções,
So we
quais
need
são
to
os limites,
understand
né, que as
what
plataformas
these
podem e devem
interventions
operar.
can
Acho que
be.
essa
What are the
é a
limits
reflexão que eu queria
to
deixar.
the
Por favor.
platforms?
Obrigada. Eu vou
That's where I want
agradecer
to
logo, até
wrap
porque eu
up.
tenho
Priscilla,
algumas
please.
respostas a dar.
Well, I
Então,
want to say
antes de
thanks
mais nada,
first
muito
because I have a
obrigada
number of
novamente,
answers
artigo 19,
that I owe a number of people. So thank you to Article 19 and the IRI. Thank you so much for the chance to be part of this amazing roundtable. Thank you to the Superior Electoral Court for your amazing job and for being great partners of ours and the other platforms in our fight against fake news. I want to answer every question that was asked, so I will work backwards from the beginning.
So Raquel, answering your questions, yes, we do have commercial policies applied to ads on our platforms, and those policies must be read in combination with our community standards when we talk about Facebook and our community guidelines when we talk about Instagram. If we're talking, for example, of one of those three specific ad categories, political ads, electoral ads, or social ads,
que tem que passar, o anunciante tem que passar por processo de autorização, ainda assim, de alguma
that
forma,
require advertisers from going through the process, if even still they can reach into our controls and have their content, while flagged, still offers something that's disinformative, their ads can also be reported via our platforms. So if that type of content can still see through our controls, because we are not infallible, and I said this morning, users can still report them. If, for example, one of those ads is an eminently political ad, but, for example, has not been flagged as a political ad, we may receive a report or even via our technologies identify that that ad does not have the necessary flag. We can pause it, but the ad will still be available on our ad library, but as paused, in paused status, and before the advertiser makes his situation straight, he will not have that ad back on. The ad will be paused during this process of regularization. But if that breach occurs, if they manage to somehow bypass our controls, and if it's something that violates our community guidelines or a community handbook, they can still be reported, and if there is a violation, what we say is there's often an overlap of violations in many cases, so they will not be suffering only one type of report. We will be moderating that content. So next question, that was Denise's questions. With regard to the democratic issues, I said this before and I'll say it again. Every election that we participate, we learn from. Whether that's on positive, bad scenarios or critical scenarios, as everyone knows, such as what we faced in the United States in 2016. And it's based on those lessons that over the years we've been able to improve not only our policies, but also the way we face up to this type of event. So what I can tell you today is, yes, we're ready, and if it comes to a critical situation within the country, depending on how the outcome of the election is accepted or not, we have rules from those relating to voter suppression to those that could or that are designed to encourage people or to spur people into violence because of political issue. Those policies will be enforced. Now, going over to Liz, I will cover all questions. I won't forget anyone. I'll give you all the answers. So Liz, about your question, which is also based on the comment about a content that came out this week, that specific piece of content was labeled as political across our platforms. And its reach was also reduced. It went in line to be fact-checked by our fact-checkers, but
Also, we direct people to the official information in the Superior Electoral Court's website so that they know what the electronic ballot box is, and it goes to fact-checkers, and once those fact-checkers do their job, and depending on how they rate the content, our fake news filter may be applied depending on their verdict. And together with that filter, there's the report with every bit of information. And it's important to highlight that this report issued by fact-checkers is very user-friendly. So it's written in very straightforward language where they will pinpoint what's fact and what's not, and what's not, why is it not true. So now let me jump to Humberto. Actually, right now we would have Denise, but I moved her up, so now we'll have Humberto. So now, Humberto, about your questions, it would be irresponsible of me to turn to you and give you specific figures for Brazil. Actually, when we invest in technology, we're talking about global investments, we're talking about machine learning, and we're talking about Brazilian Portuguese, which is extremely important to us. And when we talk about the analysts we have working around the world, these are analysts who speak Brazilian Portuguese because there's a very significant cultural adaptation that makes all the difference. So today, these analysts are around the world. We usually work on that 24/7. So regardless of when we receive those reports, we will not wait for Brazil's working hours. The report will be analyzed then and there by an analyst who speaks Brazilian Portuguese. So we have some types of content, and I'm not only talking about disinformation, but content that involves aspects such as child pornography. And whenever there's a false positive, that will be directed to specialists on that issue and who speak that language so that we have the right context to moderate the content appropriately. And lastly, to Brenda's question. I'm really, really sorry for what happened. I have no way of commenting on specific events. We can talk later to check exactly what happened and maybe even address it internally. But what I can tell you, and I said this morning, and Katie repeated that just a few moments ago, oftentimes we will have a more conservative moderation. So we will often moderate something that we shouldn't moderate. It's what we call the false positives. Unfortunately, we're not infallible, but we've been working increasingly harder to have a more accurate moderation and prevent those false positives from coming up. So I would like to apologize for what happened, and we can talk later after the panel to maybe even address internally what happened, and so that I can give you a more assertive response about what happened. But other than that, we cannot comment on specific situations. Thank you for reminding me. We do have channels to appeal the moderation, both on Facebook and Instagram. I don't know if you received any pop-up message, but if you posted something that was reported, and in that report the content is moderated and perhaps even removed, the person who has their content removed is notified in the platform, via the platform where they're posted, and they will be given the opportunity to appeal. When the person appeals, they will have access to all the elements. The appeal will be analyzed not by technology, but by individuals, and if it comes to the decision or to the realization that moderation was mistaken or misplaced,
then we will address that. Now, if the moderation is found to have been correct and that content cannot return, there's another opportunity for the individual to appeal, and that appeal will be analyzed by another analyst, because it would be it simply wouldn't make sense to ask the same analyst to run an analysis on that content again. I think that was it. Okay, thank you very much, all of you, to all of you. I wanted to thank also our guys from interpretation and our guys from the streaming and AV, and stayed with us until 6:20. So I would also like to thank all of those who worked and allowed this event to occur. So I wanted to also make Article 19 and our team available. And again, thank you, William, for your partnership. We've been working with democracy and elections for a while. Now, a bit more intensely so, because we have only a short period until the elections. We know that there are a lot of actors involved and interested. So I think it's important to have this open dialogue so that we can, as many of you said, have concerted efforts being developed, and also efforts for the long run, so that in the future mistakes are opportunities for us to learn and to not repeat them, and so that we can do whatever we can to ensure democratic security, which is what we need in the country today. So thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and it was a great pleasure to be here again with all of you.